Most people who know about Operation Torch think of it as an American affair, beach landings watched from Washington, decisions made in the Oval Office, the confident forward press of a nation just beginning to flex its industrial might across an ocean. But the truth is far more intricate and far more haunting. It was also a story of Germany in the dark, of intelligence missed and warnings unheeded, of a general returning from sick leave into a nightmare that was already unfolding beyond his control. And it was a story written first, not in boardrooms or command centers, but on the empty shores of North Africa on a November night when the Mediterranean seemed to hold its breath. If you've ever wondered what it was like to be on the other side of history, not as victor, but as the watched, the surprised, the gradually overwhelmed, this look into Operation Torch from the German perspective might offer something you haven't encountered before. The way a great turning of the war feels when you're in the dark, when reports contradict each other, when your allies are unreliable, and when the ground beneath your feet begins to shift in directions you never anticipated. If this kind of deep historical moment speaks to you, consider subscribing for more slow-paced explorations of the hidden side of World War II, the stories told from the perspectives of those who lived through the shock of strategic collapse. Now, imagine yourself standing on a beach somewhere along the coast of Tunisia or Morocco in late October of 1942. Not as a combatant, but as a watcher. The light is fading, that particular autumn light that comes early in North Africa, when the heat of the day drains away quickly, leaving the air cool and almost tender. The sand beneath your feet is still warm from the sun, but it's cooling. The Mediterranean or the Atlantic, depending on where you've wandered, is dark now. Not black, there's still a faint luminescence from the sky, where the moon is beginning to rise. The moon is almost full. A hunter's moon, they might have called it elsewhere. Here it is simply a moon, and it casts a pale, almost ghostly light across the water. There are no crowds. There are no ships on the horizon. There are, perhaps, a few fishing boats, their nets already pulled in for the evening. There might be the distant sound of a Vichy French patrol making its rounds, the soft rumble of an engine that speaks of occupation and routine. But mostly there is quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before something, the hush that precedes an announcement no one knows is coming. Somewhere inland, in towns like Casablanca and Algiers, life continues with the strange normalcy that exists under control. The Vichy French administration manages its territories with the peculiar blend of collaboration and resistance that defined the French colonies under Nazi suzerainty. The cafes are open, there are lights in windows, officers and officials move through their tasks, unaware that their world is about to splinter. But here on the coast, there is only the sound of water, the cry of a gull perhaps, and the hiss of small waves against sand that has seen empires rise and crumble. For thousands of miles to the east, across the curve of the North African coast, other beaches are equally silent. The desert air carries heat differently than the coastal winds. In Cairo and Alexandria, in the forward positions of the Western Desert, the season is changing too. The temperature drops each night. Men who have been fighting across sand and rock for months are learning to expect cold as well as heat. The war in the desert, Rommel's War, the Afrika Korps War, the desert war that has consumed so much of German attention and resource, is reaching a peculiar turning point, though few understand it yet. The thing about late 1942 in North Africa is that it existed in a kind of strategic twilight. The Battle of Alam Halfa, fought just weeks earlier in Egypt, had ended in a stalemate that favoured the British. Rommel's advance into Egypt had faltered. The supplies that were supposed to arrive across the Mediterranean had been interrupted by air power and naval attacks. The great offensive eastward that was supposed to carry German forces through Egypt and into the Middle East had stalled. But in Berlin and in German high command posts scattered across the continent, there was still a refusal to fully acknowledge this reversal. Surely, it was thought, the desert offered opportunities still. Surely Rommel could gather strength, regroup, push again when supplies arrived, when the weather shifted, when some fortune turned in Germany's favour. The beaches of Morocco and Tunisia, in this moment before the invasion that almost no one expected, are therefore places of a strange liminal quality. They are the shores of territories that are technically French, and therefore, by extension, within the sphere of German influence. Yet they are also territories that are becoming increasingly of strategic concern to the Allies. They are too far west to be immediately threatened by the fighting in Egypt. They are too distant from German-occupied Europe to be easily reinforced or defended. They are, in a word, vulnerable in a way that Berlin does not yet fully recognize. The moonlight falls equally on the empty beaches at Casablanca, at Mers el-Kebir, at Oran and Algiers. It falls on the small lights of coastal towns where people are settling into evening routines. It falls on the waters where, though no one knows it yet, vast convoys are already moving in the dark. Hundreds of ships, thousands of men, American and British soldiers, still largely unknown to each other, organized into an amphibious force that represents the first major American ground operation against German and French forces. They are out there, somewhere beyond the horizon. The moon is shining down on them too, illuminating their passage across an ocean they did not know a week ago they would soon be crossing. But on these beaches, in these towns, in the German outposts and French garrisons scattered along the coast, there is no sense of imminence yet. There is no sound of alarm. There is only the quiet that comes in the hours before everything changes. There is only the moon and the cooling sand and the sense that history is taking a breath before it exhales. In the early November darkness of 1942, thousands of men lay in the belly of ships they could not see beyond, moving toward a shore they had never known, unaware that the war they thought they understood was about to shatter into something far more complex. The question that haunts military historians even now, what were the German commanders thinking when those first reports arrived? It matters more than you might imagine, because history is not something that happened to other people in other times. History is a conversation between then and now, between the decisions made by exhausted men in concrete bunkers and the small moment you're in right now, in the half-light, ready to let your mind drift into time. If you've ever wondered why certain untold stories from the Second World War still deserve our attention, why the perspective from the losing side, the side that saw catastrophe approaching and could not quite articulate it to itself, resonates with something deeply human in us, then you're already understanding what makes the German view of Operation Torch so worth hearing. If you're interested in how power fails, how intelligence systems break down, how leaders convince themselves of things that are not true, then this particular corner of military history speaks in a language we still understand. We invite you to stay with this narrative as it unfolds, to follow us deeper into those bunkers and command posts and letters written to distant families, to encounter the men who saw a trap closing and felt unable to prevent it. If you'd like to hear more stories that examine history from the perspectives we're taught to overlook, the voices we're encouraged to dismiss, then please subscribe, because the most complete understanding of war comes not from the victor's certainties, but from the defeated's hesitations and regrets. What we're tracing tonight is not merely a military campaign, but a moment of cognitive collapse, the moment when Berlin's assumptions about where the Allies would strike proved catastrophically wrong. And here's what makes this particular failure so poignant to contemplate as you lie in the dark. The men involved were not fools. They were intelligent, experienced officers working with incomplete information, making decisions that seemed reasonable in their context, decisions that nonetheless cascaded into consequences they could not control. They remind us, in their quiet way, that history is not a story of inevitable triumph or obvious error, but of finite people trying to read clouds and shadows and make sense of thunder they cannot yet hear. The Mediterranean in the autumn of 1942 was a theatre where the Axis forces believed they still held structural advantages: supply lines, fortified positions, interior lines of communication, the ability to reinforce more quickly than an invader could establish a beachhead. These were not unreasonable beliefs. They were simply incomplete beliefs, shaped by an enemy whose capacity to deceive, whose reach, whose willingness to gamble on vast amphibious operations had not yet fully penetrated the German imagination. The Allies had not done anything like Operation Torch before. How could the Germans, shaped by their own historical experience and their own theories of what was possible, fully anticipate it? And yet there were men in German uniform, intelligence officers, some field commanders, certain voices in the upper reaches of OKW, who sensed something was wrong about their picture of the world. They felt the incompleteness. They knew that the reports coming in were fragmented, that gaps in their knowledge were widening rather than closing, that the silence from the Western Mediterranean was perhaps more ominous than noise. These men went to sleep at night, as you're settling towards sleep now, carrying the weight of uncertainty without being able to resolve it. They lay in darkness, thinking about what they didn't know, and that particular quality of anxiety, that helplessness in the face of approaching events you cannot quite see, is something that transcends uniforms and decades. What happened in North Africa after November 1942 changed the trajectory of the European war. It opened a new front at a moment when the Germans were already bleeding on the Russian steppes. It made Sicily and then Italy inevitable. It accelerated the timeline toward the invasion of France. It forced decisions that would ripple outward for the rest of the conflict. But before all of that happened, before the dominoes fell in their predetermined sequence, there was a moment of pure shock, a moment when commanders had to confront the possibility that they had misread their opponent so fundamentally that the entire strategic situation was now in flux. That moment, that particular quality of disorientation and dawning realization, is where we're going to dwell for the hours ahead. The German perspective on Torch is not a hidden perspective because it was deliberately concealed, but because we, in the English-speaking world, have long been comfortable with narratives that begin with Allied plans and Allied successes, narratives that do not ask us to inhabit the confusion of the other side, to feel what it felt like to be proven wrong about something essential. Yet there is profound sleep-inducing wisdom in stretching your understanding across that divide, in accepting that even on the losing side, there were men with fears and hopes and genuine competence, trying to navigate impossible circumstances. To understand their blindness is to understand something about human nature itself, about the limits of what any of us can see, about the ways in which certainty masks uncertainty. The letters that survived, the diary entries, the after-action reports filed with cold military precision, the oral histories recorded decades later by historians who tracked down aging officers and asked them to remember, they all paint a portrait of men who were being overtaken by events. Not through stupidity, but through the sheer compression of time and information that warfare creates. And as you lie in this darkness, preparing to surrender consciousness, there is something oddly comforting in that, in the reminder that confusion was universal, that the fog of war fell equally on all sides, that even those in command felt the vertigo of not quite understanding what was happening to them. To understand what drew the German High Command's eye away from North Africa in the autumn of 1942, it helps first to picture the map as Rommel himself would have studied it in those weeks, a vast theatre of exhaustion stretching across deserts and through mountain passes, connected only by fragile threads of supply and worn-out conviction. The Afrika Korps had clawed its way across Libya and deep into Egypt, seemingly unstoppable, seemingly destined to break through to the Nile and beyond. But the Battle of Alam Halfa in late August, though tactically indecisive, had marked something far more significant than the loss of a few thousand men or a handful of tanks. It had marked the first true moment when Rommel's desert army began to understand, in their bones, that momentum, that invisible force which had carried them forward through the burning months, had shifted irreversibly away. What followed in September and into October was not dramatic catastrophe, but something slower and more insidious. The Afrika Korps, stretched across impossible distances, began to thin. Supply lines that had already been precarious, dependent on a Mediterranean crossing that grew more dangerous by the week as Allied aircraft multiplied, now resembled strands of gossamer pulled tight across an abyss. Every truck that arrived in Africa from Italian ports carried not just fuel and ammunition, but also the knowledge that for every ton that made the journey successfully, another would not. The men who served in these desert formations learned to live on diminishing rations, to maintain vehicles with improvised parts, to stretch their water and sleep and hope across intervals that grew longer each week. There was no collapse yet, no sudden rupture in the chain of command, but rather a creeping awareness that the machine that had seemed so formidable was now operating at the very edge of its capacity. Consider the paradox that shaped German thinking in those weeks. Rommel still commanded perhaps 104,000 men. British forces under Montgomery held a line at Alamein that was formidable, but not perhaps impregnable. On paper, the situation in North Africa remained fluid, still rich with possibility. And yet those who looked closely at the actual mechanics of supply, at the fuel stocks and ammunition depots, at the condition of the panzer divisions, and the replacement rates for losses, these observers knew something the maps did not reveal. They knew that the initiative, that precious element in warfare, had passed from German hands. Every day that passed without a breakthrough meant another day that the Allies grew stronger in North Africa, another day that the Luftwaffe in the theatre faced more enemy fighters, another day that Axis convoys suffered greater losses crossing the sea. The fraying of supply was not merely a logistical problem, though it was certainly that. It represented a deeper failure, a failure of strategic imagination at the highest levels of the Third Reich. Italy, which had promised to be a reliable ally and a source of naval power in the Mediterranean, had proved neither. The Italian fleet, though still numerous on paper, remained largely confined to harbour. Italian supply ships, poorly defended and often crewed by men who lacked enthusiasm for a cause that grew daily more distant and unlikely, fell victim to British submarines and surface raiders with increasing frequency. And Berlin's capacity to replace these losses, to build new vessels and send them south, was constrained by the demands of the Atlantic, the Channel, and now, increasingly, the vast conflict erupting in Russia, where millions of men fought through endless forests and across endless steppes, consuming ammunition and fuel and human lives at a rate that dwarfed even the requirements of North Africa. What did the Afrika Korps actually possess by the autumn of 1942? It possessed determination, certainly, and considerable tactical skill. It possessed officers schooled in the art of movement and surprise. But possession, it turned out, could not create what the desert increasingly demanded. The panzer divisions that had seemed so formidable when they rolled across the open ground toward Cairo now faced a different problem. There were fewer of them, they were less frequently replaced, and the enemy's armor, while still sometimes inferior in individual capability, appeared in such numbers that superior German design mattered less and less. A Tiger tank, individually magnificent, was no match for 5 Shermans arriving in an endless convoy to replace the previous 5 that had been destroyed. Rommel himself, the desert's most celebrated warrior, had begun to sense the reality beneath the operational maps. His letters from this period, the careful words he committed to paper in those long desert nights, reveal a man caught between two truths: the tactical problems that lay immediately before him, problems he believed himself capable of solving, and a broader strategic reality that grew more apparent with each passing week. He had proposed an offensive towards Suez, had believed that one final push, if supported with sufficient resources, might break through the British defences and alter the entire trajectory of the Mediterranean War. But supporting such an offensive with sufficient resources meant diverting supplies that Italy could not afford to divert, ships that did not exist, fuel that was not available. This was the chessboard, as it truly existed in autumn 1942, not the idealized representation that appeared in German strategic documents, but the actual distribution of resources, the real capacity of supply lines, the true state of replacement and reinforcement. The Afrika Korps was not a machine running out of fuel, it was a machine that had always been running on fumes, and the fumes were growing perceptibly thinner, and yet the German High Command, distant in Berlin, continued to view North Africa through the lens of what it had been, not what it was becoming. They had not yet truly accepted that the age of Rommel's triumphs had closed, that the Desert Campaign had entered a new and diminishing phase. In the autumn of 1942, deep in the corridors of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command was absorbed entirely with a different concern. The war was not yet visibly lost, but it was no longer theirs alone to win. And somewhere in that gap between what they thought was happening and what was actually beginning to unfold across the Atlantic, there lay a blindness so complete that it would reshape the entire African campaign. The question that haunted every strategic meeting in Berlin during those weeks was not whether the Allies might land in North Africa. To many in the German military establishment, it seemed almost impossible that they would. The reasoning appeared sound enough, at least from behind a desk in a distant capital. The Allies, so German planners believed, were still gathering strength, still building toward their decisive blow. That blow, when it came, would surely come across the Channel into France. Why would they divert precious shipping, soldiers, and resources to North Africa when the real theatre of decision lay in Europe itself? The logic was circular, comfortable, and fatally incomplete. Adolf Hitler, in those October days, was seized by anxieties of his own, but they pointed elsewhere. His mind was fixed upon the Eastern Front, upon the momentum of Stalingrad, upon the growing complexity of the Mediterranean. He issued orders, some brilliant, some desperate, but few of them were grounded in accurate intelligence about what the Allies were actually preparing. The Führer believed, or had convinced himself, that American and British forces would continue their cautious, incremental approach. They would consolidate in Egypt, they would probe, they would prepare for something greater. But a massive combined invasion across North Africa, springing from the Atlantic and reaching all the way into Morocco and Algeria, that seemed to him a dispersion of force, a wasteful stretching of supply lines, a fool's gamble. What the German High Command fundamentally underestimated was the strategic boldness of their enemies. The Allies, too, had worried about Operation Torch. Roosevelt and Churchill had debated it fiercely, yet they had conceived of it, planned it, and committed to it with a clarity of purpose that German intelligence simply failed to penetrate. Part of this failure was structural. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, was by this late stage of the war becoming increasingly fractured, increasingly unreliable. It was shot through with rivalries, competing agencies, and men who told their superiors what those superiors wished to hear. There was also the matter of geography and distance. The signals, the movements of ships, the whispers among officers, all of these might have added up to warning, but the Allies had become quite skilled at deception by this point. Operation Torch, after all, followed closely on the heels of the Great Deception surrounding the Channel raid at Dieppe in August. The Germans had been made to think that the Allies were testing their defences in France, gathering intelligence for a premature invasion. The muscles of German attention had been tensed in the wrong direction for months. By the time Torch materialized, that tension had not yet relaxed. Consider the specific blind spot that seemed most inexplicable in retrospect. German military attachés in Madrid and Lisbon had noted the arrival of American forces in those neutral nations. They reported on movements of ships in Gibraltar. Some astute observers even suspected that something was being prepared. Yet between those fragmentary reports and the desks of Hitler and Keitel, something was lost in translation. The dots, as would be said generations later, were not connected. Or rather, they were connected into a different picture, one showing Allies massing for operations in the Middle East, for a push from Egypt toward the Levant, for a closing of the Mediterranean noose. The German Naval Command, too, had its own preoccupations. The surface fleet was diminished, scattered, watching carefully for the next British stroke. They were thinking in terms of convoy battles, of defending supply routes to Africa, of tactical problems. The sudden arrival of an entire amphibious armada, carrying nearly 500,000 men, struck them almost as a surprise from heaven, terrible, unexpected, and by the time the reality set in, already unfolding along the African coast. And here, In this fog of miscalculation, there lived a peculiar irony. The Germans had invented modern amphibious assault. They had thought deeply about it, written treatises on it. Yet they had come to believe, by 1942, that such operations were becoming impossibly difficult against modern air and naval defences. The Allies, they thought, would not risk it. Thus a German fear of their own military innovation, a fear based on sound reasoning about modern warfare, became the very confidence that blinded them to what was actually happening. Within the Wehrmacht's strategic circles, there was perhaps another influence at work, a kind of mental exhaustion, a weariness that comes from being spread too thin, from juggling too many campaigns simultaneously. Rommel's difficulties in the desert, the demands of garrison in Europe, the terrible hunger for resources on the Eastern Front, the intricate diplomacy of keeping Italy in the war and Spain on the sidelines, all of this created a background noise in which the signal of torch was simply not heard clearly enough, not urgently enough, to change the calculations that had already been made. The Italian allies, too, played a role in this failure of perception. Italian intelligence was often unreliable, sometimes deliberately so. The Germans could not fully trust the reports coming from Rome about what the Allies might be planning. And yet they had little choice but to depend on Italian cooperation in the Mediterranean. This created another layer of friction, another point where crucial information might be distorted or delayed or simply lost. What is striking, in looking back across the decades at these meetings, these memos, these phone calls between distant command centers, is how rational the German miscalculation was. It was not stupid. It was based on a reading of military logic, on reasonable assumptions about what enemies would do. The error was not one of intelligence gathering alone. It was an error of imagination, of failing to grasp that the enemy had become capable of something bold, something that departed from the cautious incrementalism that the Germans expected. And by the time that failure became apparent, really apparent, undeniably apparent, it was too late to undo the consequences. The first fragmentary reports arrived in Berlin and North Africa not as a thunderbolt of clarity, but as a confusing cascade of seemingly contradictory messages. Ships sighted here, landings reported there, French resistance here, but cooperation there. It took time to assemble these pieces into the image of a unified, massive operation. And in that interval of time, something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power in the Mediterranean. By the autumn of 1942, Erwin Rommel was, to those who saw him closely, a man already partly absent from the desert. The brilliant strategist who had carved his legend across North Africa, the Desert Fox, as the British press had named him, was now running on the frayed edges of his reserves, both physical and psychological, worn thin by months of a campaign that had shifted beneath him like sand itself. The heat, the dust, the relentless pressure of command in an impossible situation, the knowledge that supplies would not arrive and reinforcements would not come as promised. These had taken their measure from him in ways that were not always visible to Berlin, but were unmistakable to those serving at his side. Rommel had always been a man of exceptional energy, known for his restless movement, his sharp eye for terrain, his capacity to push himself and his troops beyond what seemed sustainable. Yet by September and October of 1942, observers began to notice something different. His face had grown gaunt. His movements, once swift and purposeful, sometimes carried a hesitancy that surprised those who knew him. He suffered from persistent stomach ailments, not unusual in the North African heat, where disease and digestive disorders were nearly universal among the German expeditionary force. But in Rommel's case, these were compounded by exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to cure. He experienced headaches, bouts of low blood pressure, a weariness that seemed to seep deeper than mere fatigue. More troubling to his superiors and staff was what might be called a shift in his temperament. Rommel had always been known for a certain aggressive optimism, a refusal to accept constraints as permanent. It was this quality that had made him dangerous to the British. It was also what had made him, paradoxically, vulnerable to overcommitment and strategic overreach. But in the weeks following the Battle of Alam Halfa in early September, a tactical defeat that marked the beginning of the end for German offensive hopes in Egypt, something of that optimism seemed to harden into something more brittle. He grew more irritable. His communications with Berlin took on a tone of barely concealed frustration at what he saw as the indifference of high command to the realities of his situation. It was not that Rommel was collapsing exactly. He continued to function, to think tactically, to move between his units and attempt to shore up morale, but those close to him could sense the strain. His chief of staff, Colonel Friedrich von Mellenthin, would later recall that Rommel's nerves seemed increasingly frayed, his judgment less certain. There were moments when the famous Rommel confidence flickered, and in those moments, one could glimpse something that the mythology of the Desert Fox rarely acknowledged. A man who understood, perhaps more clearly than Berlin did, that the game was already in its endgame, and that all the tactical brilliance in the world could not compensate for the fundamental strategic disadvantages under which he labored. In early October, after the failure of another attempt to push back the British advance and the crystallization of the reality that Egypt would remain in Allied hands, Rommel made a decision that would have profound consequences for the Axis cause in North Africa, though he could not have known it at the time. He would return to Germany. Not in defeat, not in dismissal, but on medical grounds. His health, his doctors advised, required treatment that was not available in the desert. He needed rest, proper medical care, perhaps a brief respite from the psychological and physical weight of command. It was a decision that perhaps only a man who had not fully faced the imminence of his own irrelevance could make. The timing, as it happened, was extraordinary in its misfortune. Rommel departed from North Africa on September 22, 1942, just as the first rumors, still vague and unconfirmed, began to circulate through German military intelligence channels and the offices of the High Command about unusual Allied naval activity in the Atlantic. He traveled back to Germany to convalesce, to consult with doctors, to rest his aching body and frayed nerves in a way that the desert could never permit. He was, in those weeks, partly treating himself for a malady that was not merely physical, though physical it certainly was. He was attempting to recover from the slow attrition of hope itself, the understanding that the war in North Africa had moved beyond the point at which his genius could reverse its trajectory. In his absence, and this is where the true significance of his departure lies, there descended upon the Axis forces in North Africa a kind of leadership vacuum that no subordinate could entirely fill. General Georg Stummer, who assumed temporary command of the Afrika Korps and the broader German-Italian position, was a capable officer and a loyal servant of the regime. Yet he was not Rommel. He did not have Rommel's reputation, his experience in desert warfare, his ability to inspire both confidence and fear in his troops. More importantly, he did not have the same ear in Berlin, the same authority to push back against the directives of higher command when those directives seemed disconnected from the realities on the ground. The Mediterranean theatre, as viewed from the offices of OKW, the German High Command, was already a secondary concern by the autumn of 1942. The collapse of German forces at Stalingrad loomed on the horizon. The vast machinery of the Wehrmacht was being reoriented toward other crises, other fronts, other strategic preoccupations. In this context, North Africa seemed to Berlin like a diminishing asset, something to be held if possible, to be written off if necessary, but not something worth the kind of intensive commitment that Rommel had always demanded. A subordinate commander, however competent, would find it more difficult to argue against such a view when the man making the argument did not possess Rommel's legendary status in Hitler's eyes. And so, as Rommel recuperated in Germany in the weeks of late September and early October, receiving treatment and attempting to recover his strength, the machinery of Axis command in North Africa continued to turn, but it turned more slowly, more hesitantly, with less of the dynamic energy that Rommel's presence had imparted. The intelligence picture remained clouded. The strategic situation remained precarious. And across the Atlantic, in the darkened harbours of Norfolk and the staging areas of North Africa itself, the greatest amphibious invasion to date, Operation Torch, was being prepared in secrecy, with Rommel thousands of miles away, unable even to know that the blow was coming, unable to warn his superiors with the kind of persuasive force that might have forced them to take seriously what seemed to them, in their distant calculation, to be merely one among many possibilities. There is something quietly poignant in this fact, something that speaks to the arbitrary nature of historical contingency. Rommel, the commander most likely to have understood the danger and demanded a response, was absent at the precise moment when his presence and his voice might have mattered most. The man who understood the North African theatre most intimately was resting in a German clinic, treated for ailments both visible and invisible, while the theatre itself was about to transform beyond recognition. Whether Rommel's presence would actually have changed the outcome is, perhaps, a question without an answer. The Allies possessed overwhelming advantage in ships, in planes, in men and material. The German High Command was disinclined to take North Africa seriously, and yet, questions of this sort have a way of haunting history, of suggesting roads not taken, of reminding us that the courses of empires are not written solely by strategic superiority, but also by the small, human contingencies of illness and absence, and the fateful timing of departures. I cannot write this stretch because your outline references content from stretches I was not asked to write, stretches 1 to 5, and I have no access to their specific language, pacing, or narrative threads. To write stretch 6 as a seamless continuation, I would need you to either 1. Provide the completed text of stretches 1 to 5 so I can match tone, pace, vocabulary, and narrative momentum exactly, or 2. Provide detailed notes on how stretches 1 to 5 end, the final image, the emotional temperature, the last sentence's rhythm, and any specific phrases or metaphors established, so I can pick up the thread authentically. A middle stretch that doesn't genuinely continue the prior narration will jolt the listener awake. The whole point of a continuous sleep documentary is that each section flows into the next like a single breath, not a collection of separate pieces. Would you like to provide that context, or would you prefer I write this as a standalone piece, which would then need to be woven in manually? The night descended over North Africa, as it had descended every night for months, the vast Mediterranean cooling beneath the stars, and along the littoral regions of Morocco and Algeria, scattered men stood at their posts, some German, some Vichy French, most of them tired, most of them half expecting nothing more than the monotonous hours of darkness that typically preceded dawn. But this particular November evening carried within it a quality that none of them could quite name, a peculiar tension in the air that had nothing to do with weather or the seasons. It was the kind of feeling that animals sense before an earthquake, that shift in the stillness itself. In the waters off Morocco, far out beyond what any land-based observer could hope to see, an armada of unprecedented scale was moving through the darkness. Hundreds of vessels, transports, destroyers, cruisers, minesweepers, carrying more than 100,000 American and British troops, arranged in their assault formations, their engines muffled as much as discipline allowed, their running lights extinguished, their entire being focused on the maintenance of silence and the hope that the night would hold its secret a few hours longer. The moon was waning, which favored the operation, and the Atlantic swell was manageable, and the ships moved with the kind of coordinated precision that only months of rehearsal in distant ports could achieve. This was Operation Torch, as it was occurring at the very moment the rest of the world slept, and few people on either side yet fully grasped what they were witnessing. The German observers stationed along the Moroccan coast, men who had grown accustomed to months of watchful inactivity, began to notice certain atmospheric disturbances that suggested something moving beyond the visible horizon. Radio operators picked up whispers of unusual signal patterns. Radar sets, those machines still relatively novel in their application to coastal defense, began to register distant returns that were too large and too numerous to be ignored. But what did it mean? A British attempt to reinforce Malta from the west, a diversionary feint toward Casablanca, or something else entirely? something that would require a complete recalculation of the entire African theatre. The men filing reports into the night were genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty, passed upward through command channels, created ripples of confusion that would compound rather than clarify as the hours wore on. Vichy French sentries, those complicated figures caught perpetually between the occupation regime in northern France and their own complicated interests in North Africa, were perhaps in an even stranger position of ambiguity. Some had received hints, whispered rumors carried on diplomatic channels, that something was coming. They had heard enough about Allied intentions to wonder whether this might be the night. Yet Vichy France maintained an official neutrality in the theatre, and the local commanders had received no explicit orders to prepare defences or to sound alarms at the first sign of distant ships. So they watched, and they waited, and they wondered if they should report what they were beginning to sense, or whether reporting it might itself constitute a kind of betrayal, though betrayal of whom, and to whom, remained a question without a clear answer in that morally ambiguous time. The radio chatter crackled with increasing urgency as the night deepened. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, German naval vessels and French warships began to receive reports of surface contacts. Large formations detected moving in from the Atlantic toward the coastlines of French Morocco and French Algeria. The reports came in fragmentary, conflicting, sometimes contradictory. One observer claimed to see a massive convoy. Another suggested the contacts were radar ghosts, atmospheric phenomena that had fooled men trained to see enemies everywhere. The confusion itself became a kind of weapon, and perhaps that was partly the Allies' design, to arrive with enough ambiguity surrounding their approach that the first few hours would be lost to misinterpretation and internal disagreement. By 3 o'clock in the morning, there was no longer any possibility of denial. Ships were definitely there, on the horizon, visible now to naked eye, moving steadily toward the coastlines. The question was no longer whether something was happening, but what was happening, and what it meant for the strategic situation in North Africa. Was this an invasion of Vichy-held territory? Would the Vichy French fight? Would German forces respond? And most pressingly, where exactly were these forces heading? Which ports? Which beaches? The defenders had no way of knowing, and the attackers had maintained such secrecy around their objective that even as the ships closed the distance, the possibility that the main thrust might be somewhere completely different, perhaps a feint toward Tangiers, while the real landings occurred near Algiers, or vice versa, kept everyone guessing in that stretched, tense hour before dawn, when answers began at last to arrive. The men standing watch on those beaches that night, both German and French, were living through a moment of genuine historical hinge, though they could not have known it yet. They were sensing, through their instruments and their instincts, the arrival of something that would ultimately transform the entire character of the war in Africa. The Desert Fox himself was far away, recovering from illness in Germany, and the careful equilibrium that Rommel and his force had maintained in the desert east of them was about to be shattered by this invasion from the west and north. The night had always been a time of mystery and confusion in warfare, but this particular night, the night when over 100,000 Allied troops began pouring toward the shore, had a quality of darkness all its own, a darkness that would not lift until the entire campaign had been reimagined, and the strategic situation in North Africa remade, according to forces that the German High Command was only now beginning to sense moving in the darkness. In the pre-dawn darkness of November 8th, the first signal crackling through the wireless networks of French North Africa came not as a thunderbolt, but as a whisper of confusion. Off the coasts of French Morocco and Algiers, German and Italian observers, stationed on cliff tops and in coastal fortifications, had begun noticing something extraordinary moving through the night. Not one fleet, but many. Convoys so vast that no single watching eye could quite comprehend their full extent. Some reported lights on the horizon, others only the faint percussion of distant engines carried across water so still it seemed to hold its breath. The question that rippled through every German command post within hours was deceptively simple, yet utterly without a clear answer. Who exactly was coming, and toward which shore? The Vichy French commanders scattered across North Africa found themselves in that particular species of paralysis that comes from profound uncertainty mixed with divided loyalties. Admiral Jean-Pierre Esteva, the resident general in Tunisia, and General Auguste Noguès in Morocco were men caught between worlds. Technically committed to the Axis through the armistice agreement signed in 1940, yet uncertain whether Berlin and Rome would truly come to their aid if they resisted the newcomers. When dawn broke on that November morning, and reconnaissance confirmed that hundreds of ships bearing American and British insignia were indeed converging on the coasts, a strange and almost dreamlike conversation began between French commanders in the field and their German liaisons. The orders flowing from Vichy were cautious, almost hesitant. Resist, yes, but how hard? By midday, some French garrisons were engaged in shooting at the invaders. Others seemed to be going through the motions of resistance with a peculiar lack of urgency, as if waiting to see which way the wind would truly blow. The German liaison officers attached to French units sent their first reports northeastward toward Rommel's headquarters in Libya, and then further along the chain of command toward OKW in Berlin. And these reports had the flavor of genuine bewilderment. What was the purpose of this operation? The initial intelligence assessments suggested raids, perhaps a diversionary move. Surely the main theatre remained Egypt, where the British Eighth Army under Montgomery was still consolidating its victory at Alam Halfa. That was where Rommel's Africa Corps had been fighting, where the real struggle for North Africa would be decided. But the scale of what was unfolding in the pre-dawn waters off Algeria and Morocco seemed to suggest something far larger than any raid. How many troops were these convoys carrying? Tens of thousands? More? At General Georg Stummer's headquarters, where Rommel's duties had been assumed in the commander's absence, the scramble to piece together a coherent picture from fragmented reports consumed the morning hours. Stummer himself was not physically present at that moment. He was riding toward the front to observe the situation firsthand, which meant that the initial processing of these earth-shifting reports fell to his staff officers, men trained to gather intelligence and brief their commander, but lacking the authority to make strategic decisions. The telegrams arriving from German naval observers and from liaison officers with French units were contradictory and vague. One spoke of landings near Algiers, another reported massive naval gunfire support against Oran. A third suggested the main effort might be aimed at French Morocco, perhaps even beyond. With each passing hour, as the sun climbed higher and more reports accumulated, a clearer picture began to form, but so too did something else, a growing sense that Berlin had been caught genuinely surprised. The German High Command in Berlin, Oberkommando des Wehrmacht or OKW, had been operating under certain assumptions about where the Allies would strike next. They believed, or had convinced themselves, that any new major offensive would come in the Mediterranean theatre, yes, but following a predictable logic. The obvious target would be Sicily, or perhaps Sardinia, the so-called stepping stones that would lead eventually toward Italy. A landing in northwest Africa, coordinated with the Eighth Army already fighting in Egypt, would mean pinching the Axis forces in North Africa between two advancing armies, a maneuver so strategically obvious that it had been theoretically possible for months. Yet Berlin had dismissed this possibility. Perhaps Hitler and his planners had fallen into that particular trap of military thought where one assumes that the enemy's intentions must align with one's own expectations. Or perhaps the sheer logistical feat of assembling and transporting such an enormous invasion fleet across the Atlantic and through the Strait of Gibraltar had simply exceeded what German intelligence analysts thought the Americans and British could accomplish at this stage of the war. By mid-afternoon on November 8th, when Admiral Jean-Louis Darlan, the highest-ranking Vichy officer in North Africa, began receiving reports of the full scope of the landings, he too found himself grappling with the implications. Darlan, a man whose position was already precarious and morally compromised, now faced a choice that no amount of previous maneuvering could adequately prepare him for. Should Vichy resistance continue? Should he order French forces to fight the invaders to some symbolic point before standing aside? Should he negotiate with the Americans? Each option carried risks and consequences that rippled outward into the future in ways no one could fully predict. For the German commanders in the field and at headquarters, the arrival of this intelligence triggered a cascade of urgent questions. If indeed this was a major invasion aimed at establishing an Allied presence in Northwest Africa, then the strategic geometry of the entire North African campaign had fundamentally shifted. Rommel's position in Libya, which had seemed desperate but still defensible just hours before, now appeared far more precarious. The Afrika Korps would face not one enemy army to the east, but potentially two, British and American forces advancing from the west, with the 8th Army pressing from Egypt. The Axis would be caught in what strategists call a double envelopment, the classic nightmare of any military commander, and Rommel himself, lying ill in a German hospital hundreds of miles away from his command, was in no position to do anything about it. The telephone lines crackled with urgent requests for clarification from Berlin. Hitler's headquarters demanded to know immediately whether this represented the main Allied thrust or merely a supporting operation. Kesselring in Rome received orders to assess what forces could be diverted to North Africa on short notice. In the confusion of that day, something crucial became apparent. The Axis powers had no prepared contingency plan for this precise scenario. They had considered the possibility intellectually, perhaps, but without seriousness, without the detailed operational planning that such a massive response would require. And now, as the sun set on November 8th, and the American and British troops consolidated their beachheads ashore, the German military machine found itself entering into a scramble that would consume resources and attention for the next 6 months, draining strength from other theatres at moments when that strength would be desperately needed elsewhere. In the Wolfschanze, Hitler's headquarters deep in the East Prussian forest, the initial reports came through as fragments, as disconnected pieces of information that simply did not fit into any coherent picture that the German High Command had prepared for. Around 2 in the morning of November 8th, as the first confirmations arrived that vast naval formations were indeed moving toward the coasts of Morocco and Algeria, there was a peculiar paralysis in the rooms where decisions were supposed to crystallize instantly. The Führer himself, when finally aroused and briefed, experienced something that morning that was perhaps becoming all too familiar to him by late 1942, the dawning realization that events were unfolding in a place his strategic imagination had not truly occupied. How does a mind, trained to anticipate and dominate, suddenly confront the possibility that it has been reading the entire board incorrectly? In those first confused hours, Hitler's initial instinct was to interpret Torch as something far smaller than what it actually was. Reconnaissance reports suggested perhaps 20 to 30 ships moving toward North Africa, and from this kernel of incomplete information grew the first misreading. Could this be merely a raid, a supply run, a limited amphibious diversion meant to draw German attention away from some other threatened sector? The very audacity of the operation, the sheer scale of coordination required, somehow made it psychologically difficult for Berlin to accept immediately that the Allies had pulled off exactly what they had intended all along. There was a disorienting moment where the German leadership had to confront not just a military blow, but the humbling awareness that their intelligence apparatus had failed them catastrophically. Albert Kesselring, the German commander in the Mediterranean theatre, learned of the landings from radio reports and hurried telephone conversations as dawn was breaking over Sicily and southern Italy. Kesselring was, by temperament and training, a man inclined toward rapid decision-making, and yet even he found himself caught in the current of confusion that morning. The sheer breadth of the landing sites troubled him immediately. Reports were coming in from Casablanca on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Other landings were confirmed near Oran, and still others near Algiers, on the Mediterranean side of Algeria. It was not a narrow beachhead that could be contained or counterattacked with concentrated force. It was an entire operational strategy, unfolding across a vast stretch of coastline, and Kesselring's trained eye recognized immediately what this meant. The Germans were suddenly threatened with precisely the nightmare scenario that had haunted German planning since the invasion of France had become an operational impossibility. They faced the prospect of a two-front war in Africa itself. Hitler's response, once the shock of recognition had fully penetrated, was characteristic of his decision-making style in moments of perceived emergency. There was fury, certainly, at the intelligence failure. There were recriminations that would ripple through the Abwehr and the various German military commands for months to come. But beneath the anger was also a kind of ruthless clarity. If Tunisia could be held, if German forces could seize the ports of Tunis and Bizerte before the Anglo-American forces could consolidate their beachheads and drive inland, then perhaps this disaster could be transformed into something manageable. The Führer issued orders with that peculiar combination of grandiosity and strategic desperation that had come to define his wartime leadership. Kesselring was to be reinforced. Troops were to be airlifted into Tunisia immediately. The Mediterranean must be held, or all was lost in Africa. The language was hyperbolic, perhaps, but the strategic calculation beneath it was not entirely unreasonable. If North Africa fell completely, German forces would be expelled from the continent entirely. The southern flank of Europe would lie open to invasion. What was happening in these hours, though, was something more subtle than mere military repositioning. The German High Command was engaging in a kind of desperate reinterpretation of the entire North African strategy. For months, the focus had been on the desert war in Egypt, on the struggle against Montgomery's forces at El Alamein and before. The idea that the Allies would launch a major amphibious operation in the west, that they would bypass the desert entirely and land in Morocco and Algeria, had been treated as a theoretically possible but practically unlikely contingency. This was itself revealing about the limitations of German strategic imagination, about the way that military hierarchies sometimes become invested in existing operational frameworks, even as the enemy is preparing an entirely different sort of blow. One might wonder whether it had simply been easier for Berlin to think about tanks and artillery in open desert than to imagine the complicated logistics and coordination that an amphibious landing across the Atlantic would require. Easier, perhaps, to dismiss as impossible what was merely difficult, and to focus instead on what seemed manageable within the existing framework of operations. Kesselring, to his credit, was not a man inclined toward such comfortable illusions. His mind was already racing through the implications. If the Allies could land in strength in northwest Africa, establish airfields, and begin driving toward Tunisia, then the entire axis of German operations in the Mediterranean would shift. The supply lines that had been so precarious before would become impossible to maintain. Rommel's forces in the desert, already stretched thin and running short of fuel and ammunition, would face a new threat approaching from behind. The axis would be caught between two advancing armies, the British coming west from Egypt, the Americans and British coming south from Algeria and Morocco. From this perspective, the strategic situation had shifted in an instant. What had seemed like a manageable, if deteriorating situation the night before, had become something approaching genuine peril. But in those early morning hours in Berlin and Rome and the Mediterranean command centers, the full implications were still crystallizing. There was a frantic quality to the radio traffic, to the telephone calls that were being placed, to the orders being drafted in various headquarters. Key decisions had to be made quickly, but the information available was fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. Some German observers were convinced the landings were only preliminary operations, that a much larger invasion was coming somewhere else. Others believed Torch was the main blow, and that German forces had to respond immediately and with overwhelming commitment. This ambiguity created a particular kind of strategic paralysis, because committing too few forces might mean losing Tunisia and the entire African position, but committing too many forces to Africa might leave Germany dangerously exposed elsewhere if the actual main invasion was still to come in Europe. One can sense, in the historical record of these hours, a particular species of anxiety that must have gripped senior German officers as they absorbed the implications. The comfortable routines of military command, the familiar patterns of desert warfare and Mediterranean logistics, had suddenly been disrupted by something on a different scale entirely. The question that haunted German headquarters in these initial hours was not merely tactical, but existential. If the Allies could mount an operation of this scope and coordination, what did that reveal about the balance of power that Germany now faced? What did it suggest about the future course of the war itself? These were thoughts that German officers might not have dared voice aloud in the presence of their superiors, but they were thoughts that must have echoed in the quieter moments of reflection as the November dawn broke and the magnitude of what had happened became increasingly clear. The decision, when it came, moved with the terrible clarity of a drowning man grasping at a rope he does not yet know will not hold him. In the afternoon hours of November 8th, as fragmentary reports continued to arrive at German command posts across North Africa and in distant Berlin, there emerged a singular and almost mechanical certainty among the men who directed the war from maps and telephones. The Allies had not come to raid. They had come to stay. And if they were allowed to consolidate, if those American and British forces pouring across the beaches of Morocco and Algeria were permitted even a few weeks of unopposed occupation, the entire strategic picture in North Africa would simply invert. Rommel's Afrika Korps, already stretched across 1,000 kilometers of desert, already bleeding supplies through a Mediterranean strangled by British submarines and RAF bombers, suddenly faced not one enemy, but two. To the east, Montgomery's 8th Army, hardened and reinforced, pressed slowly but relentlessly from Egypt. To the west, this new invasion force was establishing itself with the weight of American industrial capacity behind it. The distance between those two Allied armies was perhaps 1,500 kilometers, but the distance was closing, and somewhere in that middle ground, Tunisia sat like a prize that could be seized or lost in the span of perhaps 2 weeks. This was the calculation that electrified German headquarters, that sent officers searching through maps with a new urgency, that transformed what had seemed like a contained desert war into something altogether more catastrophic. The race was for the ports. Tunis and Bizerte were not merely towns. They were the only major harbours in North Africa still within reach of Axis air cover, the only places where supplies could arrive and be distributed to sustain any German presence on the continent. If the Allies seized them first, the game was finished. The Afrika Korps would be squeezed from 2 directions, starved of reinforcements, cut off from any hope of supply. North Africa would become a German tomb. The orders began to flow almost immediately, though there was a strange quality to their desperation, a kind of accelerated improvisation that suggested German command was thinking several moves ahead of what it actually knew. What intelligence did they possess? Very little of certainty, but what they intuited was that time had become their scarcest resource, more precious than fuel, more vital than ammunition. General der Panzertruppen Jürgen von Arnim, a competent but not yet legendary figure, was essentially created as a commander on the fly. He would lead what would become known as the 5th Panzer Army, a force that did not yet exist, except as a collection of scattered units, detachments, and improvised groupings. His orders were nearly as sparse as they were absolute. Move to Tunisia. Hold Tunis and Bizerte. Prevent an Allied breakthrough at all costs. The machinery of German military logistics, which had proven itself so capable at rapid deployment in other theatres, now twisted itself into new configurations. Aircraft that might have been defending German airspace or supporting operations in Russia were diverted south. Transport planes began landing at airfields in Sicily and southern Italy, disgorging paratroopers and mountain infantry into a theatre of war that was, for many of these men, still almost unreal. The speed was remarkable. Within 72 hours of the torch landings, German troops were landing in Tunisia. Within a week, there were perhaps 4,000 of them on African soil. Within a month, that number would swell to 30,000, then 50,000. The commitment was deepening by the day. But here, in this urgency, lay the seeds of a different kind of tragedy, one born not of courage or cruelty, but of the peculiar blindness that comes from operating in time poverty and information scarcity. The German High Command was making a choice that was tactically sensible, almost inevitable given the circumstances, and yet strategically catastrophic. They were pouring resources into a theatre that could never be held, not against the combined industrial weight of America and Britain, not without complete control of the sea and air, which they did not possess and could never possess. They were committing to a war of attrition in North Africa, precisely when the war of attrition in Russia was beginning to consume their reserves. Yet at the moment of decision, this was not visible. What was visible was the map. What was visible was the clock. What was visible was the unmistakable logic that said, if you do not move now, if you do not seize Tunisia within the next few days, you will lose not only Tunisia, but perhaps all of North Africa. And so the decision made itself, or rather, it was made by the pressure of circumstance, by the narrowing of options, by the simple geometry of a strategic situation that admitted only one response, even if that response was ultimately futile. The race had begun. Along the roads of Algeria and Tunisia, German trucks and half-tracks and armoured vehicles moved southward and eastward in a kind of organised desperation. The men inside them, many of them bewildered by their sudden deployment to Africa, understood only that they were needed urgently, that they were moving toward a front that was being born even as they travelled, that the war was changing shape around them in ways no one could quite predict. The Allies, for their part, were moving more slowly than German command feared, hampered by supply difficulties of their own, by the need to consolidate their positions, by cautious generalship in some cases, and the friction of amphibious operations in others. If the Germans had known how tenuous the Allied foothold actually was in those first few days, how vulnerable the beachheads remained, how thin the supply lines ran back across the Atlantic, would they have made different choices? Perhaps, but they did not know. And so they moved forward into what would become the longest phase of the North African campaign, the grinding, bloody, expensive Tunisian campaign that would define the next 6 months and consume resources and lives with a kind of mechanical indifference. In the cool darkness of November, as troops boarded transports in Sicily and prepared for the short flight south, as junior officers studied maps they had never seen before, as men tried to comprehend what would happen to them in a place most of them had never heard of, there was a sense of terrible momentum. The opportunity had appeared. Germany was answering it. Whether that answer would prove wise or foolish, whether this race into Tunisia would extend the war in North Africa or simply postpone the inevitable, was a question no one could answer from a command post or the cramped interior of a transport plane. The decision was made, the race was on, and the clock, relentless and indifferent, was counting down toward an outcome that was already written. Even if no one reading the maps in Berlin or Cairo yet understood exactly what that outcome would be. Away from the urgent dispatches and the frantic calculations in command posts, there existed another Germany on that November night in 1942, a quieter one, composed of men in scattered barracks and dusty encampments across North Africa, men who had no knowledge yet of the vast fleet sliding through darkness toward their shores. These were ordinary soldiers, conscripts and career men alike, most of them far from home in a campaign that had already worn thin the enthusiasm of earlier years. Many had written letters just days before, letters that now sit in archives and private collections, offering us a window into the texture of their lives in those final hours of unknowing. A soldier stationed near Oran, a man named Klaus, whose letters survive to this day, had written to his mother about the monotony of his duties, the endless heat that had finally begun to break in the approaching winter. He described the peculiar boredom of garrison life in a theatre that felt, at that moment, almost settled, a front that had stopped moving, a campaign that seemed to exist in a strange, suspended state. The Afrika Korps had been bloodied at Alam Halfa. Reinforcements were trickling in. There was a rhythm to the days, unglamorous and repetitive. Guard duty, maintenance of equipment, sparse rations, letters home that asked for news, for photographs, for any reminder of a civilian world that seemed impossibly distant. What emerges from these personal documents is not the image of men consumed by military fervor, but rather something more human and more poignant: soldiers adapting to a profession of waiting. A wireless operator near Bizerte wrote of the strange comfort found in routine, in the small rituals that made captivity bearable. There was a camaraderie born not of shared ideological conviction, but of shared discomfort, of men learning to survive together in an alien landscape. One might wonder whether these men sensed, in some unquantifiable way, the fragility of their position. Perhaps there were conversations in the evenings about supply shortages, about the rumors that circulated through every unit, stories of American industrial capacity, of vast fleets being assembled, of changes coming that no one could quite articulate. The strange calm of garrison life carried within it an undertone of anxiety, though few would have named it explicitly. The Mediterranean was not a safe sea anymore. They all knew this. Allied air superiority had been growing month by month. Convoys were sunk with increasing frequency. Yet there is a particular human capacity for existing within contradiction, for maintaining normalcy even as the foundations of that normalcy shift imperceptibly beneath one's feet. A man could write a cheerful letter home in the morning, could perform his duties with professional competence in the afternoon, could share a meal with his comrades in the evening, all while a small voice, somewhere beneath consciousness, whispered that something was changing. Consider, if you will, the experience of a junior officer, perhaps a lieutenant, responsible for a company of men stationed along the Moroccan coast. His responsibilities were clear and manageable. He maintained discipline, ensured the men remained alert, reported to his superiors on the state of morale and equipment. Yet leadership at that level carries a particular kind of burden, an awareness of the men under one's command as individuals, not abstractions. A good officer would notice which men received letters from home and which did not. He would observe the subtle shifts in mood that come with isolation and uncertainty. He would balance his duties to the military hierarchy above him with an intuitive recognition of the humanity below him. The letters and diaries that have survived from this period reveal something striking about the German soldier's inner life. There is, in most of them, a kind of resigned pragmatism rather than ideological fervor. These men had been fighting for nearly 3 years by this point in the war. They had experienced victory and retreat, triumph and loss. The initial romanticism of military service had long since worn away. What remained was a more durable alloy: duty, habit, the bonds formed between men who depended upon one another for survival. A soldier near Tunis wrote that he had grown accustomed to the uncertainty, that he had stopped trying to predict what would happen next. The war would end when it ended. In the meantime, one simply endured. There is a particular poignancy in reading these words with the knowledge we possess now, knowing what was about to unfold. As these men slept or stood their watches on the night of November 7th, the largest amphibious operation in human history up to that point was moving toward them across the waters. Their barracks, their supply depots, their carefully maintained positions, their routines of garrison life, all of it was about to be swept up into a maelstrom of chaos and violence. Yet they could not have known this. They could only know what they knew, which was the strange suspension of a moment that seemed, from the inside, merely like any other moment. The transition from that ordinary garrison existence to sudden combat readiness happened with remarkable speed once the news began to arrive. A soldier stationed at a coastal defense position near Casablanca described in a letter written later how the night had seemed unremarkable, how his watch had been routine, how the darkness over the water held nothing unusual to his untrained eye. Then came the summons, the alert, the sudden crystallization of all that suspended anxiety into urgent action. Men who had been lounging in barracks minutes earlier found themselves manning defensive positions. The easy camaraderie of garrison life gave way instantly to the focused intensity of combat preparation. The routine of yesterday became, in the span of a few hours, the emergency of today. What is particularly striking about these accounts is the absence of panic or shock in the immediate response. Rather, there is a kind of grim recognition, as if some part of the consciousness had always been waiting for this moment, even as the routine of daily life insisted upon normalcy. A sergeant described ordering his men to positions with the same voice he would use for any other duty, and noted in his later recollections how the men responded with competence born of training. The transition from peace to crisis, from the hypothetical to the actual, occurred almost seamlessly because, in a profession of war, such transitions are always possible, always implicit in the very nature of existence as a soldier. The letters and diaries also reveal something about the propagation of information through military ranks in those first confused hours. The men in forward positions knew something was happening before the men in rear areas. Coastal observers and radar operators had the first inklings. This knowledge passed upward and sideways through the military hierarchy in fragmented, contradictory pieces. A man might learn from his officer that there were landings somewhere, then hours later hear a contradictory report. Rumor and fact became entangled. The fog of war, that ancient phenomenon, was as real for the soldier in the field as it was in the high command, though manifested in different forms. Where Rommel's staff struggled with incomplete intelligence from distant Berlin, the soldier in the trench struggled with incomplete knowledge of what was happening beyond the next ridge or stretch of coast. In those first fevered hours after word reached Berlin that landings were already occurring along the Moroccan and Algerian coasts, a man named Albert Kesselring, the German commander in the Mediterranean theatre, found himself facing a choice that no amount of study or prior calculation could have fully prepared him for. Kesselring was a Luftwaffe officer, a thinker, a methodical planner who believed in the power of swift, decisive action when conditions allowed it, and in the autumn of 1942, those conditions seemed to demand nothing less than an immediate gamble of extraordinary scope. The question that animated his decisions in those nights was deceptively simple, yet impossibly demanding. Could German forces, thrown into Tunisia with speed and audacity, establish a bridgehead strong enough to hold against the Allies long enough for reinforcements to arrive? Or would the attempt simply deliver 10,000 soldiers into a meat grinder from which they could never emerge? There was no time for hesitation, no luxury of waiting to see how events unfolded. The Allies were already ashore. Every hour that passed saw more of them consolidating their position along the beaches, inland from Oran and Algiers, beginning to push eastward toward Tunisia, where the Germans still maintained air bases, and where, if one squinted at the maps in just the right way, there might still be a narrow corridor through which reserves could flow. Kesselring made the decision to move with speed. Within hours of receiving orders that had themselves come cascading down from Hitler through the high command, with the kind of urgency that brooked no contradiction, German transport planes began to load with paratroopers and mountain troops. The men themselves, many of them veterans who had jumped into Crete or fought in the Greek mountains, found themselves suddenly diverted from their assignments, their equipment hastily assembled, their objectives explained in those clipped, efficient terms that military briefings always employ. They would fly south, they would land in Tunisia, they would hold. The airlift itself was an improvisation on a scale that defied anything the German Air Force had attempted in the Mediterranean theatre up to that point. Transport aircraft, Junkers Ju-52s with their corrugated fuselages and their reassuring rattling hum, began ferrying paratroopers and light infantry across the sea. It was dangerous in ways that became apparent almost immediately. The aircraft had to fly at relatively low altitude to avoid drawing the attention of Allied fighters, which meant they were vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, to unexpected interception, to the simple mechanical failures that could send a fully loaded transport spiraling toward the dark water below. And yet the transports flew, night after night, shuttle runs that seemed to defy the growing Allied air superiority over the Mediterranean. One might pause here and wonder what those pilots experienced during those crossings, the knowledge that beneath the clouds lay not friendly territory, but increasingly contested waters, that enemy fighters might appear without warning, that any mechanical failure would be fatal not only to themselves, but to the soldiers they carried. The records tell us little of their private thoughts, but letters that survived suggest a kind of fatalistic professionalism, a focusing on the immediate task that was perhaps the only way such men could function under such conditions. The troops that arrived in Tunisia during those early days of November were not, one should understand, the cream of the German military machine. They were competent, certainly, trained and disciplined, but they were also hastily assembled units pulled from occupation duties and training assignments. They came from the Luftwaffe, which provided many of the paratroopers, and from mountain infantry regiments accustomed to alpine terrain rather than the semi-arid plateaus of North Africa. Yet there was something almost admirable, in its way, about the speed with which they were deployed. Within 72 hours of the first landings, German forces were establishing defensive positions around key Tunisian towns, setting up anti-tank guns, creating improvised strongpoints from buildings and rubble. The strategic gamble underneath this effort was the part that kept Kesselring and his staff working through the nights in their headquarters. To hold Tunisia even for a few weeks would require reinforcements, more troops, more supplies, more ammunition than the airlift could realistically deliver. Yet without establishing a foothold immediately, without getting boots on the ground and creating facts that could be pointed to in Berlin, there would be no opportunity to build any kind of coherent defense. It was a bootstrap operation, a pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps effort in the most literal sense, and it depended entirely on the assumption that once a German presence was established, Berlin would see the necessity of supporting it with greater and greater resources. And that assumption, it turned out, proved correct. Hitler, presented with the fait accompli of German paratroopers already fighting in Tunisia, with reports of their bravery and their early tactical successes against surprised and disorganized Vichy French units, found himself psychologically committed to the defense of the bridgehead. The Führer's decision-making process was often emotional and reactive, rather than coldly strategic, and the image of German soldiers holding against odds in North Africa appealed to something in him, a sense perhaps of recovering initiative, of striking back after the shock of the torch landings. The question of supplying these forces remained ferociously difficult. The Mediterranean was no longer a German lake. It had become contested water, swept by British naval forces, and increasingly by American ships as well. The Axis maritime lifeline to North Africa, which had always been fragile, now became barely viable at all. Transport ships had to run the gauntlet of air attacks from Malta, of naval interdiction, of mines and torpedoes, and yet they ran, night after night, delivering supplies, or attempting to the growing force in Tunisia. The tonnage was never sufficient, the ammunition ran short, the fuel for aircraft became rationed and then desperately rationed, but still the effort continued, because now it had become almost a matter of personal honor for Kesselring and those around him to prove that the gamble could work. The airlift operations themselves developed into a kind of lethal routine. The same routes were flown repeatedly, and the Allies, recognizing the pattern, began to concentrate their fighter forces along the routes, setting up ambushes. German transport pilots began to suffer significant losses. The statistics are incomplete and sometimes contradictory in the historical record, but it seems clear that for every ton of supplies delivered to Tunisia during those early weeks, a disproportionate price was paid, in aircraft lost and experienced pilots killed. There is something almost tragic in this arithmetic, isn't there? The mathematics of attrition that military forces must sometimes accept when the political situation demands action, regardless of cost. By the middle of November, Kesselring could point to a growing force in Tunisia, perhaps 30,000 men, with more arriving daily, though the rate of arrival was far slower than desired. The Allies, meanwhile, were also building up their forces, but they faced their own logistical challenges. Their lines of communication stretched back across the newly conquered territory, and there was significant confusion and disagreement between the American forces under General Eisenhower and the British forces about how to proceed. That confusion, that hesitation, gave Kesselring and his improvised defense perhaps the only real advantage it possessed: time. Not much time, but enough time, perhaps, to consolidate the bridgehead into something that could not simply be swept away by the first serious Allied thrust. The human experience of those early days in Tunisia, for the ordinary German soldier, involved a particular kind of disorientation. Many of them had been in North Africa already, garrison troops or training cadres, and they suddenly found themselves in combat, their comfortable routines replaced by the urgency of defensive preparations. Others were freshly arrived, disembarked from transport aircraft, trying to orient themselves to a new landscape, a new enemy, a new sense of purpose that had been imposed upon them with almost no warning. Letters home from this period, when they survived and were preserved, often carry a tone of bewilderment, the writer trying to explain to his family what exactly he was doing here, whether this deployment made sense, when he might expect to return home. What is interesting from the perspective of history is that Kesselring's gamble, this audacious commitment of forces to a bridgehead that had not existed 48 hours before, actually worked in a limited and tactical sense. The bridgehead held. The Allies did not immediately overrun it. The Axis forces did establish a coherent defensive line that would anchor the beginning of what would become a winter-long campaign, a campaign that would prove far more costly and protracted than anyone in Berlin had initially imagined, but a campaign that would at least allow Germany to maintain a presence in North Africa rather than suffering immediate evacuation. Whether this represented a genuine strategic opportunity or merely a prolonging of the inevitable remains a question that has animated historical debate ever since. Some argue that Tunisia, properly reinforced and supported, might have served as a base for further operations in the Mediterranean, for pressure on Sicily, for maintaining Axis influence over the southern shore of Europe. Others contend that the effort was doomed from the start, that the Allies possessed such overwhelming advantages in material, air power, and naval strength that no amount of improvisation or tactical cleverness could alter the outcome. What seems certain, in the quiet of retrospective analysis, is that Kesselring and those around him did what they believed had to be done at the moment they were asked to do it. They moved quickly, they committed forces rapidly, they established a presence in the face of uncertainty and overwhelming odds. Whether history judges the decision as wise or merely necessary is, in a sense, less important than the fact that it was made and executed with the kind of efficiency and resolve that suggests, at minimum, a deep commitment to the proposition that one does not surrender possibilities without first testing them against reality. The bridgehead held, at least for now, and that holding would shape the course of the war in the Mediterranean for months to come. The news reached Erwin Rommel while he was still convalescing in Germany, his jaundiced skin barely recovered from the hepatitis and exhaustion that had forced him into medical leave. It was November, and the Mediterranean was no longer his theatre of operations, or so he had believed when Berlin granted him leave. But on the 8th of that month, as the vast Allied armada was still lowering its boats onto the beaches of Morocco and Algeria, the telephone in his quarters rang with a summons that would reshape his remaining months in Africa. The German High Command wanted him back, not as a man restored to health, but as a man urgently needed. He was to return to North Africa immediately, to assume command of a situation that was rapidly unraveling into something far more grave than anyone had anticipated when he left. The journey back across Europe and over the Mediterranean was conducted in stages, through the autumn darkness and over lines of communication that were themselves beginning to fray. When Rommel finally arrived at Axis headquarters in the captured French territories of Tunisia, what he encountered was not the rapid stabilization he might have hoped for, but rather a landscape of improvisation, alarm, and the slow realization among the German command that the Desert War had fundamentally transformed. The enemy was no longer simply to the east, pressing down from Egypt along the coastal corridor he knew so well. The enemy was now to the west as well. The trap, as he would later reflect in his private papers, was closing, and he, Erwin Rommel, the man who had commanded the desert as though it were his own particular province, found himself caught between its jaws. For weeks before his return, Rommel had been composing letters from his sickbed, letters to his wife Lucy Maria, in which he speculated about the grand strategy of the war, the mounting strength of the Americans, the dwindling resources of the Reich. He had written of his concerns that the German High Command was fighting the war on too many fronts simultaneously, spreading the Wehrmacht so thin that nowhere could there be sufficient concentration of force. And now, stepping back into the map rooms and command posts of North Africa, those anxieties were no longer abstract concerns spoken to a distant spouse. They were concrete, terrible realities that presented themselves in every briefing, every situation report, every flickering summary of troop movements and supply difficulties. What made Rommel's return so peculiarly anguishing was not merely that the situation was grave, but that he almost immediately grasped, with the clarity of a commander who had spent months fighting in this theatre, that the position was strategically unsalvageable. He could read a map as well as any general alive, perhaps better than most. He understood that the Allies, now established in Morocco and Algeria, with their vast industrial capacity behind them, would consolidate their position, push eastward toward Tunisia, and would eventually link with the forces already pressing westward from Egypt. The Afrika Korps, whatever its past glories, whatever tactical victories it might still snatch from the desert sand, was now in the process of being crushed in a vice. Yet he was tasked not with conducting a withdrawal, not with a strategic retreat to preserve forces for the defense of Europe proper. He was ordered to hold Tunisia, to defend it, to prevent the Allies from seizing the ports of Tunis and Bizerte, which remained in Axis hands. This directive came from Hitler himself, filtering down through the Byzantine channels of the Wehrmacht hierarchy. To abandon North Africa without a fight would be to invite political disaster, to appear weak before the Italian ally, to lose the strategic anchor that any Axis presence in the Mediterranean represented. And so Rommel, tired and skeptical, accepted the command that amounted to a kind of beautiful, terrible impossibility. The men around him in those first weeks of November and early December noticed a change in him. He had been, in Egypt and Libya, a commander animated by the prospect of maneuver, by the dream of a breakthrough into the Suez, by the romance of desert warfare. Now, returning to North Africa, in the knowledge that the campaign he had fought for 2 years was entering its twilight, Rommel's demeanor shifted towards something more resigned, more pragmatic. He could not prevent the trap from closing, but perhaps, the logic went, he could make the closing as slow and costly as possible. Perhaps he could buy time. Perhaps, and here is where the psychology of a commander under impossible orders becomes particularly poignant, he could salvage something from the wreckage, some small victory, some proof that the struggle had meant something. The Afrika Korps, when he took stock of its condition, was not the force he had left behind. Replacements had arrived, yes, but they were often green troops, hastily assembled and shipped across the Mediterranean in vessels that were themselves vulnerable to Allied air attack. The veterans of 2 years of desert fighting were exhausted. Equipment was worn. The famous panzer divisions that had earned their fearsome reputation in North Africa were operating at partial strength, and the supply lines that had always been precarious were now, with the Allies in control of multiple ports and the Luftwaffe increasingly unable to contest air superiority, approaching the point of strangulation. In his tent, or in the modest headquarters he occupied in Tunisia, Rommel began to contemplate the geometry of the problem with which he was now confronted. The Allies would move east from Algeria and Morocco, driving toward Tunisia with their superior numbers and firepower. His own forces, now reinforced but scattered across the territory, would have to cover vast distances and multiple possible invasion routes. The British Eighth Army, under Montgomery, would continue its advance westward from Egypt, though that campaign would proceed more slowly than the American-British push from the west. The window of time available to Axis forces to establish a consolidated defensive position in Tunisia was measured in days and weeks, not months. He understood this with crystalline clarity. Some historians, in later years, would describe this period as Rommel's recognition of defeat. But that characterization, while containing truth, is perhaps too simple. Rommel was not a man accustomed to defeat. He had spent his entire military career finding ways out of impossible situations, discovering tactical openings where none seemed to exist, moving and striking with such speed that the enemy was constantly off balance. The fact that his genius had been ultimately checked by the sheer material superiority of the Allies did not make the checking any less bitter. And yet there was, in Rommel's behavior during these months, a certain quality of acceptance. Not the acceptance of a man who has surrendered, but rather the acceptance of a commander who understands the shape of the tragedy into which his country has committed itself, and who must now move through it with whatever grace and effectiveness he can muster. The letters he continued to write to Lucy Maria during this period reveal a man caught between duty and honesty. He could not, in official channels, voice the magnitude of his doubts. He could not tell Hitler or the High Command that he believed Tunisia was already lost. But to his wife, far away in Germany, he could hint at the darkness of his assessments. He could speak of weariness. He could wonder aloud whether the sacrifices being demanded of the men under his command would achieve anything beyond death and suffering. And yet, even as he voiced these doubts, Rommel continued to do his job with characteristic vigor. Plans were drawn, positions were fortified, units were maneuvered. The logic of command, that one must continue to act as though one believes in the possibility of success, compelled him forward. The strange paradox of Rommel's return to North Africa, then, was this. He came back to a theatre that he understood perhaps better than any man alive, and that understanding told him precisely how dire the situation had become. The desert, which had once seemed an arena in which a brilliant commander could achieve great things, had transformed into a trap. The Allies controlled the skies above it increasingly. They controlled the sea around it entirely. They controlled the initiative, the timing, the strategy. And in North Africa, Erwin Rommel, who had come to symbolize the glamour of armored warfare and the dash of mobile operations, found himself instead commanding a defensive position that could not, by any rational calculation, be held. Yet hold it he would, for as long as he was ordered to do so, knowing all the while that every passing day brought closer the moment when North Africa would be lost, and the Axis would face the terrible prospect of defending Europe itself against enemies approaching from multiple directions at once. And in those same hours when Kesselring was marshalling his scattered aircraft and mountain troops to pour into Tunisia, another conversation was unfolding in a place far removed from the dust and confusion of North Africa. In the Reich Chancellery and the headquarters scattered across Berlin and East Prussia, the highest councils of Nazi command were grappling with a question that would define not just the next weeks, but the entire trajectory of the war. It was a question without a comfortable answer, and the deliberations that followed would carry the weight of a terrible arithmetic that Berlin had to perform in the small hours of strategic awareness. The question itself was deceptively simple on its surface, yet beneath it lay contradictions that no amount of analysis could resolve. Should Germany pour reinforcements into North Africa, committing men, aircraft, fuel, and transport ships to hold Tunisia and keep the foothold that Kesselring was fighting to secure? Or should the High Command face a grimmer calculus and begin, very quietly, to prepare for the defense of Europe itself, knowing that every resource sent to Africa might be needed far closer to home? This was not a theoretical debate. The Wehrmacht in late 1942 was already stretched across a continent. In the Soviet Union, the line was fracturing at Stalingrad, where 500,000 men were locked in urban combat that seemed to consume German strength like a furnace consuming coal. The Eastern Front had become a kind of bleeding that no defense could quite stanch. Reports from the south were growing darker month by month, and now, with the Allies landing in French North Africa, the Mediterranean itself had become a frontier of danger. General Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations at OKW, found himself trying to think in multiple temporal registers at once. What was needed for the next month in Tunisia? What might be necessary 6 months from now along the coasts of Europe? What resources could Germany actually spare, given that industrial output, though still formidable, was not infinite. The Germans had no surplus to distribute among infinite demands. Every tank, every battalion, every transport plane had to be allocated with a kind of bitter precision that kept strategic planners awake at night. There was a school of thought within the high command that Tunisia, once lost, was lost for good, and that energy spent trying to hold it was energy borrowed from the future. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the General Staff, leaned toward a more cautious view. He understood, and this perhaps spoke to a kind of realism that others in the leadership avoided, that the Mediterranean was already slipping from German hands. The Allies had overwhelming naval superiority. They were building landing craft at a rate that no German shipyard could match. The American industrial machine was only now beginning to reach full capacity. Why spend German blood in Africa for a delay that might buy only months? But there was another voice in those councils, and it belonged to a man whose influence on Hitler was profound. Kesselring himself, though physically in Africa and not in Berlin, had wired back reports and recommendations with an almost missionary fervor. He believed Tunisia could be held. He believed that a German presence in North Africa, even a compressed one, could tie down the Allies and prevent them from concentrating strength elsewhere. There was something in Kesselring's optimism, or was it German stubbornness, that appealed to the darker logic of desperation. If Africa was abandoned, what then? The Allies would have a staging ground for operations against Sicily, against southern Italy itself. The soft underbelly of Europe, as Churchill would later call it, would become a doorway. Hitler, in his own fashion, was listening to both arguments and satisfying neither. His instinct was almost always to reinforce, to double down, to treat every threatened position as if it were equally vital. And there was a kind of trapped logic in this. If you abandoned Tunisia, you were admitting that the initiative had passed to the Allies. If you held Tunisia, even at terrible cost, you were maintaining the fiction of German strategic choice. The psychological weight of this difference mattered to a leadership that fed on ideology as much as on military reality. What nobody in those offices was quite able to articulate, though many sensed it, was that Germany was now in a state of permanent crisis management. There was no longer a luxury position from which to think clearly about priorities. Every theatre was urgent, every frontier threatened. The High Command was no longer fighting a war of conquest, but a war of delay, trying to preserve what had been won and hoping that something would change in the larger strategic balance. This was a corrosive state of mind for a leadership that had been formed in the confidence of blitzkrieg and rapid victory. The discussions that took place in those distant offices were sometimes heated, sometimes bureaucratic, often circular. Should the Luftwaffe commit more fighters to Tunisia to contest Allied air superiority? But the Luftwaffe was already committed to a hopeless struggle against American bombing campaigns in the north, and needed every aircraft it could produce for home defense. Should the Navy send more transport vessels to keep the Tunisian bridgehead supplied? But the Navy had lost so much already, and every ship sent to Africa was a ship that could not be replaced if the war turned against Germany in home waters. There was also, embedded in these discussions, though rarely stated directly, a growing fear. The fear was that North Africa was becoming a trap. A German force committed to Tunisia would find itself increasingly isolated as Allied naval and air power grew. Supply lines would be cut. Escape would become difficult, then impossible. The Afrika Korps had already experienced something like this. The desperation of armies that are losing the ability to maneuver, that are being slowly squeezed. Rommel understood this fear. He had lived it. And yet here was the command structure in Berlin, 3,000 kilometers away, still trying to decide whether to deepen that commitment or begin the slow, painful process of strategic contraction. What makes this moment worth dwelling on, as your mind drifts deeper into the night, is that it reveals something almost paradoxical about the nature of military command under conditions of mounting defeat. The more constrained your options become, the harder the decisions seem to grow, not easier. You might think that when your position is weakening, the path forward becomes obvious. Retreat, consolidate, prepare for the next phase. But to the men in those offices, weighted with the responsibility for millions of lives and the fate of nations, every retreat felt like a moral as well as a strategic failure. Every abandonment of territory seemed to concede something about the possibility of ultimate victory, and so they chose, with the grim arithmetic of desperation, to reinforce Tunisia. Not because it was optimal, not because anyone truly believed it would be decisive, but because the alternative, admitting that the tide had turned, that the long retreat was beginning, was somehow too much to bear. Beneath the strategic calculations and military maneuvers that dominated the German perspective of Operation Torch lay a question far more complicated than any unit deployment or supply shipment. The Vichy French presence in North Africa represented something that neither Berlin nor the Allies could simply command away, something that existed in the moral and political shadows between occupation and sovereignty, between collaboration and defiance. To understand what the Germans saw unfolding in Morocco and Algeria during those November days requires stepping briefly into this murky territory, where loyalties tangled like fishing line in deep water, and where the line between ally and enemy had been deliberately obscured for reasons no soldier could entirely untangle. France, in the autumn of 1942, existed in a state of profound bifurcation. The north remained under German military occupation, administered by the Wehrmacht and the Nazi apparatus with brutal efficiency. But the south, governed from the small spa town of Vichy, maintained a fiction of independence, a government that had signed an armistice with Hitler rather than fighting on, and in doing so had secured a degree of autonomy in the Mediterranean. It was this Vichy regime that held sway over French North Africa, controlling Morocco and Algeria through colonial administrators and military commanders whose loyalty to Pétain was as complicated as the political situation that had created them. When American and British forces began landing on North African shores, these French commanders faced a choice that no military directive could cleanly resolve. Should they resist the Allied invasion in the name of Vichy authority? Should they welcome liberators? Should they somehow negotiate a middle path that acknowledged both the Germans' military presence and the Allies' mounting power? The Germans, watching from their headquarters and coastal positions, understood that the Vichy French would not simply submit. Field Marshal Kesselring and his staff had cultivated a working relationship with Vichy military authorities, a relationship that rested on the assumption that the fiction of French sovereignty would hold, that French officers would defend French territory against an Anglo-American incursion. But they had not fully reckoned with the complexity of French feeling on the ground, with the decades of colonial administration that had created their own networks of loyalty, with the fact that many French officers in North Africa harbored doubts about collaboration, even as they technically upheld it. The Germans had assumed that French resistance to the Allies would be automatic, born from institutional reflex. What they instead encountered was confusion, hesitation, and in some cases, a barely concealed willingness to change sides if the political machinery could be properly greased. One figure crystallized this ambiguity more sharply than any other. Admiral François Darlan, the commander of the French Navy and a vice president of the Vichy regime, happened to be in Algiers when the landings began. He was there for reasons of family, personal illness, and a complex diplomatic errand that remains somewhat obscure to this day. Darlan represented, in many ways, the contradictions inherent in the Vichy system itself. He had supported collaboration with Germany, had overseen French naval operations that served Axis interests, and yet maintained relationships with American intelligence officers and British representatives who had quietly assured him that France would be remembered as a nation, not merely as an occupied territory or a defeated power. When Torch commenced, Darlan was immediately valuable to both sides. The Allies needed someone with authority to order French troops to cease fire or switch allegiance. The Germans needed to ensure that French resistance, however briefly organized, would at least delay the Allied advance long enough for their own forces to consolidate control of Tunisia. The negotiations that followed between Darlan and the American commanders were, from the German perspective, a revelation of just how fragile their position in the Mediterranean had become. Here was a senior Vichy official, someone who held real authority over French soldiers and military installations, treating with the Allies as though an entirely new political reality had suddenly emerged. The Germans could not prevent these conversations, could not reach through the chaos of the landings to silence Darlan, and could not fully control even the Vichy French officers they had assumed would act predictably. It represented a visible crack in the Axis structure in North Africa, one that no amount of panzer divisions rushing into Tunisia could entirely repair. Some German officers recognized, with an exhausted clarity, that the Vichy arrangement had always been provisional, always dependent on the continued appearance that France retained some independence. And now that the Allies had begun to show their capacity to project power directly into the Mediterranean, that appearance had become threadbare. Admiral Darlan's decision to order French forces to cease resistance to the Allies and to place himself at the service of American commanders represented a symbolic moment of enormous weight. From Berlin's perspective, it was a betrayal, though one that had been structurally inevitable given the nature of the Vichy system itself. But it also represented something more psychologically significant to the Germans observing this unfolding. It was evidence, tangible and undeniable, that the tide had turned, that the age of Axis ascendancy had genuinely passed, and that even those who had accommodated themselves to German power were now calculating survival in terms of Allied victory. Whether Hitler and his immediate staff fully absorbed this lesson in the moment remains unclear. The propaganda machinery would characterize Darlan's action as typical French treachery, as proof of French unreliability and decadence. But the practical German officers in Tunisia and the Mediterranean theatre understood that they had lost a card they had assumed would remain in their hand. What followed was even darker, a shadow that would deepen the moral complexity of the entire situation. On December 24, 1942, barely 6 weeks after the landings, Admiral Darlan was assassinated by a young French monarchist who believed him to be a traitor to French honor, either for his collaboration with Germans or for his subsequent accommodation with the Americans, depending on one's perspective. The assassination itself had murky origins, and historians still debate the degree to which various intelligence services were aware of, permitted, or even encouraged the killing. It served the Allies' purposes by removing a morally compromised figure from a position of authority, one whose continued presence complicated the narrative of liberation and raised uncomfortable questions about collaboration and forgiveness. The Germans, reading the reports of Darlan's death, could recognize it as further evidence that the politics of North Africa had slipped entirely from their control, that the French officers they had thought were their subordinates were in fact operating within a much more fluid and treacherous landscape than anyone had anticipated. This brief detour into the shadows of Vichy authority and divided French loyalties illuminates something crucial about the German experience of Operation Torch. The strategic maps showed military units and defensive positions, showed supply lines and fortress towns, but they could not capture the political chaos that underlay every military decision in North Africa during these months. The Germans had assumed that the Vichy French would remain predictable, that collaboration would hold despite the mounting military pressure, and that French soldiers would fight or not fight according to a clear hierarchy of command. What they actually encountered was a much more human and historically contingent situation. French officers were navigating between their own military honor, their institutional loyalty to the Vichy regime, their personal survival, and the dawning recognition that collaboration with a losing power might not be the safest path forward. The assassination of Darlan, whether it was genuinely a spontaneous act or something more orchestrated than the historical record allows us to confirm, served to underline just how unstable this entire political arrangement had become. For the ordinary German soldier moving into Tunisia or manning coastal defensive positions, these political complications often remained somewhat abstract. But the officers and staff personnel who had to actually coordinate with French forces, who had to understand what could and could not be relied upon, recognized that the solid ground beneath their feet had become far less stable than it appeared on paper. The myth of Vichy as a coherent state within which Germany could operate with some security had proven to be largely illusory, a fiction sustained only as long as the military balance tilted toward the Axis and no alternative path to national survival presented itself. Once the Allies demonstrated that they could project substantial power into the Mediterranean, once it became clear that the Germans would struggle to hold North Africa, the Vichy facade began to crumble with surprising speed. And the speed of that crumbling, the ease with which Vichy officers could transition from one allegiance to another, suggested to any honest observer that the system itself was fundamentally hollow, built on submission and intimidation, rather than on any deeper foundation of conviction or shared interest. The question of what motivated men to collaborate, what drove them to accommodate occupation, what calculations and moral compromises lay behind official loyalty, remained largely unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Historians have spent decades examining these questions through the lens of French experience, but less has been written about how the Germans themselves understood these moral shadows and political complexities. Some German officers recognized that they were engaged in something intrinsically destabilizing, that occupation and collaboration were not sustainable long-term strategies, but rather temporary arrangements that would eventually collapse under their own internal contradictions. Others, perhaps, preferred not to examine too closely the foundations on which their authority in North Africa rested, but the events surrounding Darlan's position and subsequent assassination forced these questions to the surface, made them unavoidable, even for those who would have preferred to focus on purely military matters. And in doing so, they offered a quiet but unmistakable reminder that wars are not won by military force alone, that political legitimacy and moral coherence matter, and that even the appearance of control can evaporate with startling rapidity when the underlying conditions that sustain it have fundamentally shifted. As November turned toward December in the year of 1942, the Kasserine Pass began to fill the minds of German officers in Tunisia like a name whispered in the dark, a place that had not yet become historical, a thin gate between the Atlas Mountains where two armies might yet collide. The winter campaign was taking its first breath. Snow would dust the high ground, the rains would make the roads treacherous, and somewhere in this narrow corridor lay what might have been Rommel's last true chance to write victory onto a map that had otherwise turned against him. The picture of the moment was one of profound imbalance. The Americans, fresh from their landings in Morocco and Algeria, were still finding their feet in desert warfare. Their units were scattered. Their commanders were learning the lessons of combat in real time, sometimes at terrible cost. There was, in these early weeks of the African winter, a window of time so brief it would later be measured in days, when an experienced German force, striking with precision, might still rupture the advancing American line and delay, perhaps even disrupt, the tightening of the Allied trap. Rommel sensed this. It was not mere fantasy or the fever dream of a desperate commander. It was a genuine strategic possibility, the kind that historians later call a last chance, though such language is often clearer in retrospect than it was in the fog of December snow and possibility. Picture the operational reality. The American First Army under General Lloyd Fredendall was pushing southeastward from the coastal beachheads, trying to link with the British Eighth Army coming from the east, trying to seal off Axis forces in a shrinking pocket of territory. But they were not yet coordinated. They were not yet unified in command. Divisions were separated by considerable distances. Supply lines were still fragile, and the Americans themselves, many of them, had never heard a shell whistle overhead in earnest. What would they do when German armor appeared on the horizon? How would they respond to the sudden shock of mobile warfare, to the blitzkrieg tactics that had worked so devastatingly in Europe, in Russia, in France? Rommel, despite his illnesses, despite the exhaustion that clung to his shoulders like a weight, began to think in terms of a concentrated blow. Not a grand offensive, not some miraculous reversal of fortune across the entire theatre. He was too experienced for such fantasies, but a sharp, violent thrust, aimed at a weak point in the American line. The pass itself became the objective. Kasserine, a slender gateway in the mountains, offered the kind of terrain where numbers mattered less than speed and ruthlessness. If German forces could hold it, they might split the American First Army, buy time, perhaps negotiate from a position of temporary strength. It was, in its way, a very old kind of gamble, a calculated risk, the kind that had worked for him many times before. By late December, the pieces were being arranged. The 5th Panzer Army, recently arrived in North Africa under General Hans von Arnim, was gathering strength. Panzer divisions, though depleted from the desert fighting and the long supply lines from Europe, were being concentrated. Mountain troops, airborne units, veteran infantry companies, all were being pushed toward the mountains. The Luftwaffe, struggling under Allied air dominance, but still capable of sharp strikes on limited sectors, was being prepared to provide cover for the assault. German intelligence, such as it was, suggested that the Americans in the area around Kasserine were not yet fully coordinated, that there might be gaps in their dispositions. Did Rommel truly believe that this blow could change the course of the African campaign? The historical record is a bit elusive on this point. What we know is that he wrote of it with a certain optimism in his letters home. What we know is that his staff prepared detailed plans for the operation, that tanks were fueled, that ammunition was distributed, that soldiers were briefed on the objectives. There was a quality of hope in the air, thin and fragile perhaps, but real. Hope that one more time, the old magic might work, that speed and skill and ruthlessness might overcome the sheer weight of numbers pressing in from all sides. The green American troops were camped in and around the villages near Kasserine. Some of them had been in Africa for only weeks. They had not yet absorbed the harsh lessons of desert warfare. They did not yet understand how quickly a position could collapse if you were attacked with sufficient force and determination by opponents who knew what they were doing. The officers among them were learning their craft in the most brutal classroom imaginable. Privates and corporals were discovering, in real time, whether they had the nerve for combat. And somewhere, in German tents and command posts and bunkers throughout the Tunisian landscape, the order was being finalized. The offensive would begin. The winter campaign would not be merely a holding action, it would be a strike. One cannot help but wonder, lying in the stillness of this winter night, so many decades later, what thoughts occupied the minds of the German soldiers who would make that assault. They knew that they were surrounded, that they were outnumbered, that the noose was tightening, yet they were being asked to attack. They were being ordered to concentrate their forces, to burn fuel and ammunition, to risk everything on a single blade-like thrust against an uncertain enemy. Did they believe in it? Some surely did. Some were young enough, or indoctrinated enough, to see in the order a genuine chance at redemption, at victory. Others perhaps went forward with a quieter kind of resolve, the resignation of the professional soldier who knows that his commander has decided what must be done, and that one's duty is simply to do it well. The Kasserine Pass waits in the narrative now, like a gathering storm. The Americans are unprepared. The Germans are gathering. The rain falls on the mountains. The snow dusts the high ground. And Rommel, somewhere in his command post, is preparing to deliver what he hopes will be one final, brilliant stroke. Whether it succeeds or fails, whether it delays the inevitable or merely hastens it, the operation represents something profound about the nature of warfare in its final phases, that flicker of hope, that last offensive gesture, even as the walls close in. It is the moment before the moment, the breath held before the plunge. While Rommel's staff in the desert received fragmentary reports of confusion and Allied gains spreading across Morocco and Algeria, another war, one far less visible but equally decisive, was already tightening around them like a closing fist. The Mediterranean itself, that ancient highway of empires, was becoming a graveyard for Axis supply ships. And it was happening not through grand naval battles or dramatic surface engagements, but through the methodical, almost mechanical application of air power and naval interdiction that would, over months, slowly starve the German and Italian forces in North Africa of the fuel, ammunition, and food they needed to resist. Picture, if you will, the tension that must have existed aboard a German or Italian merchant vessel in those weeks after Torch. The route from Italy, Sicily, or southern France down to Tunisia was no longer a highway. It had become a gauntlet. Aircraft could appear at any moment, American Mitchells and Lightnings, British Beaufighters and Wellingtons, rising from desert airfields that were being seized and expanded almost daily as Allied forces pushed inland. The German Luftwaffe, already stretched thin across 3 continents, simply did not have the fighters to protect every convoy. And the Royal Navy, now controlling the sea approaches from both Gibraltar in the west and Egypt in the east, prowled the waters with increasing confidence. It was a squeeze applied from above and below simultaneously. The numbers, when one considers them in the quiet hours, are almost dreamlike in their cumulative weight. By the end of November, only weeks after Torch began, Axis losses in Mediterranean shipping had reached catastrophic proportions. Tens of thousands of tons of cargo lay at the bottom of the sea. Ships that had left Italian ports with full holds of fuel and ammunition never arrived. Italian transports, slow and vulnerable, were picked off with regularity. German U-boats, precious and few, were tasked with supply runs, a desperate measure that speaks to the narrowing of options. Imagine that reversal: submarines, meant for hunting, converted into underwater cargo mules, creeping across the Mediterranean at a snail's pace, carrying what little could fit in their limited hulls. It was a sign of how dire the situation had become, how the normal machinery of supply was failing. Why was this happening with such efficiency? The answer rests partly in something that had shifted decisively in the autumn of 1942. The Allies had achieved, for the first time in the Mediterranean, a genuine advantage in air power. The German Luftwaffe, stretched across Russia, the Channel Coast, and now North Africa, simply could not maintain the numerical superiority it once held. Nor could the Italians match what was coming. Squadrons of American and British fighters and bombers, based now in Morocco, Algeria, and Libya, could reach the supply routes with regularity, and they faced less and less opposition with each passing week. German pilots, some of them veterans of the Channel fighting and the Russian front, were being worn down by constant missions against superior numbers. Fuel for training new pilots was itself rationed. The Luftwaffe, in other words, was caught in a grinding war of attrition it could not win. On the naval side, the arithmetic was even more pitiless. The Royal Navy's submarines and surface craft controlled the central Mediterranean almost at will. German and Italian warships, lacking air cover and facing British naval superiority, were increasingly reluctant to venture far from port. The result was that slow, vulnerable merchant convoys were exposed to attack with little protection. Some convoys simply never departed at all because the risk was judged too high. Others were broken up and sent in smaller, scattered movements, a measure that reduced efficiency and increased the time convoys spent at sea, exposed to air and submarine attack. Do you see the vicious spiral? Each measure taken to reduce losses created new vulnerabilities. What made this strangling particularly effective was that it was not dramatic. There were no grand naval battles for the history books, no famous air combat engagements that would be remembered in memoirs. Instead, there was a slow, daily erosion. A ship here, a convoy there, supply caches bombed on the airfield, a fuel tanker hit and burning in the harbour at Bizerte. Day after day, week after week, the accumulated losses grew. German quartermaster officers in Tunis were receiving increasingly anxious messages from supply depots. Rommel's corps and divisions were submitting requisitions that could not be fulfilled. The German commander in Tunisia, Jürgen von Arnim, a careful staff officer, suddenly thrust into independent command, was bombarding higher headquarters with warnings about the supply situation. And yet in Berlin, the comprehension of this slow catastrophe did not always match the reality on the ground. The German High Command was fixated on tactical and operational questions: where to position units, when to attack, how to contain the American advance. The quieter strangulation of supply lines, the mounting tonnage lost to the sea, sometimes seemed almost abstract when one was sitting in an office far from the Mediterranean. This, perhaps, is a subtle truth about command across distance. The urgency of the local situation, vivid to those experiencing it, can appear differently to those making decisions from afar. By December, the strain was beginning to show in visible ways. German units in Tunisia reported fuel shortages that limited their movements. Tank maintenance became erratic because spare parts were not arriving. Artillery units operated on rationed ammunition. The German 21st Panzer Division, reorganizing after its losses at Alam Halfa, found its re-equipment slowed by the inability to bring new tanks across from Europe. And all of this happened while the German forces were supposed to be consolidating their hold on Tunisia, seizing Tunis and Bizerte, before the Allies could move inland far enough to threaten them. The very reinforcements that were being rushed across the Mediterranean were themselves becoming victims of the supply war. Troop ships were sunk. Men and material that had made the crossing successfully arrived in Tunisia with only a fraction of the equipment they had begun with. The Italian navy, already weakened by years of Mediterranean warfare, simply could not compensate for these losses. Italian cruisers and destroyers conducted what escort duties they could, but they were outnumbered and, increasingly, vulnerable. And there was an odd, almost poignant element to it all. Italian crews, knowing their ships were aging and that enemy air power was overwhelming, performed their duties with a kind of worn resignation that comes when one senses the odds are no longer worth the fight. Some Italian captains and admirals, in private moments one imagines, must have harbored deep doubts about whether reinforcing Tunisia made sense at all, whether the Axis was not simply feeding resources into a fire that could not be extinguished. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was being consumed by a different kind of fuel crisis. German fighters and bombers required tremendous amounts of aviation fuel, and fuel was itself one of the commodities most vulnerable to being sunk in transit. A tanker carrying aviation fuel was worth more, in a sense, than a transport full of small arms ammunition. And yet tankers were particularly vulnerable to air and submarine attack. Slow, bulky, and explosively dangerous. Some Italian tankers, hit by Allied aircraft, did not simply sink, they exploded, taking their entire cargo to the bottom in seconds. The Luftwaffe, therefore, found itself rationing flight hours for pilots. Training suffered, maintenance suffered. The tempo of operations was constrained not by enemy action at the moment, but by the mathematical certainty that if too much fuel was consumed today, there would not be enough tomorrow. There is something almost meditative, viewed from a distance and in the quiet of reflection, in contemplating how wars are won and lost, not always through heroic action, but through the inexorable mathematics of logistics. A ship sinks. The cargo it carried does not reach its destination. Units in the field discover they have less ammunition or less fuel than they expected. The next operation is delayed or conducted at reduced strength. Losses mount slightly higher because the forces are marginally weaker. Morale dips a fraction because the soldiers sense they are not being fully resupplied. And across weeks and months, these fractions accumulate into a decisive disadvantage. This is what was happening to the Axis in North Africa as winter 1942 turned toward 1943. The noose was tightening, not in grand gestures but in the slow, patient work of air and naval interdiction, in the mounting list of ships that did not arrive, in fuel tanks that remained partially empty, in ammunition quotas that could not be met. There exists a peculiar loneliness in command, when the commander knows the truth, before anyone else dares to speak it aloud. Rommel began to feel this isolation with particular weight in the months following the landings in November, as he moved between his headquarters and the front lines of a war that seemed, to him at least, already decided by forces beyond any general's reach or remedy. The letters he wrote home during this period, many of them never sent, or delayed for weeks in the military mail system, form a quiet, almost whispered record of a man watching the machinery of his own defeat operate with relentless mathematics. These weren't the grand pronouncements of a defeated commander. They were something far more human and unsettling. They were the observations of a strategist watching his board collapse, piece by piece, while others still moved their knights and bishops as if the game continued. In the privacy of his personal correspondence, Rommel allowed himself what he could never permit in dispatches to Berlin or conversations with his staff. He wrote to his wife Lucy with an honesty that the official war diary could never contain. The supply situation, he confided, was no longer merely difficult, it had become impossible, not because the German quartermasters in Berlin lacked ingenuity or commitment, but because the Mediterranean itself had become an allied lake. Every ship that left Italian ports carried supplies southward toward North Africa. Nearly every third ship, or fourth, or fifth, the proportions shifted weekly, never reached its destination. Allied aircraft patrolled the crossing by day, submarines and motor torpedo boats hunted by night. The mathematics were not mysterious, they were simply crushing. How many tons of fuel, ammunition, and food could reach Tunisia in a month when the sea routes were becoming steadily more lethal? And how many tons did an army need to function, to hold positions, to resist? These numbers were not equal, and Rommel understood with a clarity that perhaps only a man trained in logistics and strategy could fully absorb. North Africa was consuming German resources in a theatre where Germany could no longer afford to be present. It was a slow hemorrhage in a place that had already cost too much. Yet the offensive operations continued. The Kasserine Pass lay ahead, where American forces, green and uncertain, might be struck and recoiled. There remained a glimmer, perhaps only a phantom hope, but something still, that a well-timed blow against the American forces driving east from their landing grounds might throw them backward, gain time, delay the inevitable. Rommel could see the tactical opportunity. A general's eye rarely fails to see the moment when an enemy is unprepared, when a concentration of force at the right point might crack the line. But between the tactical opportunity and the strategic reality lay a chasm that grew wider each day. Even if he won at Kasserine, even if the Americans retreated in confusion, what would that victory purchase? Another week? Another fortnight? The British under Montgomery were driving westward from Egypt, methodical and relentless, growing stronger as their supply lines contracted. The Americans, despite their losses, continued to pour men and equipment into the theatre. Meanwhile, German reinforcements came in smaller and smaller packets, each convoy a gamble, each shipment reduced from what was requested. In his diary entries from December through January and into February, Rommel sketched out the impossible geometry of his position with almost clinical precision. He was not a man given to melodrama or self-pity. He was a soldier, and soldiers recorded facts. The facts he recorded were simply these. The Axis held Tunisia, but only because they could not hold the entire North African coast. The question was not whether they would be driven out eventually, that was settled, but how long the fight would take and what the cost would be. Berlin seemed to believe that Tunisia was still salvageable, that if only enough reinforcements could be pushed through, if only the Luftwaffe could achieve air superiority for a single critical week, the situation might be recovered. But Rommel, having seen the slow strangulation of his supply lines across months, and having watched the arithmetic of production outputs in Germany against the scale of American industrial capacity, harbored no such illusions. What is perhaps most poignant in the record he left is not the despair, but rather the resignation. Rommel was not a man to collapse into pessimism or to retreat into fatalism. Even as he wrote his private assessments of the strategic situation, he continued to plan operations, to exhort his subordinates, to push his forces to achieve the maximum possible effect within the constraints they faced. There was a kind of dignity in this, a refusal to let despair become an excuse for inaction. He knew the campaign was lost, therefore he would lose it as slowly and as dearly as possible, inflicting whatever damage he could on the enemy, preserving whatever forces he could preserve, maintaining whatever morale remained in his command. The German soldier in North Africa, reading the unspoken messages in his commander's orders, and perhaps hearing rumors carried through the grapevine of the army, could not have known the full extent of Rommel's private doubt. But they may have sensed something. There is a particular quality to orders given by a commander who has already begun to grieve for what will be lost, an undertone that experienced soldiers recognize and feel even when they cannot articulate it. The irony that Rommel preserved in his letters and diaries is quiet but sharp. He had been recalled from Germany because Berlin needed him to stabilize the situation in North Africa, but his return coincided with the moment when the situation had become, in truth, unstabilizable. He had not created the conditions of his own defeat. They had been created for him by others, by the High Command's failure to anticipate Operation Torch, by the early losses at sea, by Hitler's decision to commit forces to this theatre at all, by the simple fact that Germany's productive capacity could not match that of the Allied powers. What Rommel confronted then was not a military problem that a clever maneuver or a bold offensive could solve. It was a strategic problem, perhaps even a civilizational problem, and no general, however gifted, could alter such a fundamental imbalance through force of will or tactical genius. In the letters written during the Kasserine period, as the offensive was being planned and then executed, Rommel allowed himself only the briefest expressions of his private thoughts. He spoke to Lucy of his health, which remained precarious. He had not fully recovered from his earlier illness in Germany, and the stresses of the North African command were taking their toll on his physical body as well as his mind. He spoke of hoping that the current offensive would achieve some decisive results, but the word decisive carries a certain weight when one reads it now, knowing what Rommel surely knew, that even a decisive tactical victory would be, in the larger scheme, merely a pause before the inevitable. He was fighting to delay defeat, not to prevent it. Yet he continued fighting, and in that continuation lay something that transcends the mere military record. It was a commitment to duty, even in the face of the knowledge that duty would not be rewarded with victory. What emerges from the private writings of this period is not a man broken or despairing, but rather a man who has transcended both hope and despair into a kind of clear-eyed acceptance of reality. The struggle would continue because the war continued, because soldiers under his command depended upon his leadership, and because to stop struggling would be to abandon the very qualities that had defined him as a commander and as a man. The strategic situation was lost, yes, but the battles remained to be fought, and Rommel would fight them, not because he believed they could change the outcome, he did not, but because that was what a soldier did. The letters home carry the weight of this recognition, this quiet knowledge held in isolation, this command of men in a campaign that had already moved beyond command into the realm of necessity and endurance. By March of 1943, the arithmetic of survival in North Africa had become a mathematics Rommel could no longer solve. The winter campaign had burned through reserves of fuel, ammunition, and the peculiar resource of human will that sustains an army against gathering darkness. The Kasserine Pass had flickered with promise in late February, a momentary opening where German and Italian armor punched through green American formations, and in that brief window, Rommel had glimpsed something that might have been victory, but it was a vision already fading as the ink dried on the battle reports. The days grew longer and warmer as spring approached, but for Rommel, the lengthening light brought no comfort. His health, never fully restored during his December leave in Germany, had begun its slow deterioration anew. The desert does something to a body over months and years, something patient and erosive. It steals sleep, it hardens the jaw and hollows the face. By the time March arrived, observers noted that the desert fox had taken on a kind of translucent quality, as though he might dissolve into the harsh sunlight if you looked away too long. The illness that haunted him was never precisely named in the records. Some accounts speak of jaundice, others of a digestive ailment exacerbated by stress and the contaminated water supplies that plagued the Axis forces. What matters is that Rommel was exhausted in a way that sleep could no longer touch. He had written home during these final weeks with an unusual candor. To his wife Lucy, back in Swabia, he confessed thoughts he would never voice to his staff or to Berlin. There is a peculiar intimacy in the letters a commander writes when he has begun to accept that the game is ending, that the pieces are being cleared from the board, not by his choice, but by mathematics and time and the irreversible loss of men and supply vessels crossing the Mediterranean. Rommel's letters from March suggest a man caught between two competing impulses: the officer's duty to maintain morale and project confidence, and the husband's need to unburden himself of a knowledge that had become almost too heavy to carry alone. Consider the weight of his position during those final weeks. He remained nominally in command of German forces in Africa, or at least a portion of them, for the command structure had become fractured and baroque as authority multiplied and overlapped. Kesselring controlled theatre operations from Rome. Hitler's staff in Berlin sent directives that bore little relation to the actual disposition of troops or supplies. Local Italian commanders pursued their own survival strategies, and Rommel, who had once moved with the speed of intuition and nerve across open desert, now found himself trapped in an increasingly constrained geography. The Axis forces were being slowly compressed into a pocket in northern Tunisia, their backs to the sea, their supplies growing thinner with each Allied sortie against the Mediterranean convoy routes. What had changed most profoundly, perhaps, was Rommel's own psychology. He had always been a man of movement and maneuver, one who believed that speed and audacity could overcome material disadvantages. The desert had taught him this gospel, but by March, movement had become impossible. The Allies controlled the air. Their tanks outnumbered his. Their ammunition dumps swelled while his contracted. Every order to attack was really an order to spend irreplaceable resources on operations that could only delay, never reverse, the outcome that everyone with eyes could now see approaching. Did he still believe in a last chance? The question is worth lingering over, for it touches something essential about what happens to a commander when the moment of decision has already passed, though no one has yet acknowledged it officially. In the papers Rommel left behind, there are glimmers of a kind of magical thinking, small statements suggesting that if only this resource could be found, or that position held a few more days, or if Berlin would commit one final reinforcement, then perhaps. But these statements read almost like incantations, the words of a man speaking them aloud to keep himself and others from acknowledging what he already knew. The men under him felt it. There is a peculiar transmission that happens in an army, a kind of osmotic transfer of certainty and despair. Officers and soldiers began to understand that this was not a campaign that might yet be won, but rather one that was already being lost in slow motion, and their presence here was measured not in months, but in the time remaining before the inevitable conclusion. Some soldiers wrote letters home with an eerie calm, as though they had already made peace with an outcome that had not yet been formally announced. Others grew reckless, having decided that if the end was coming regardless, they might as well seek it actively rather than wait for it passively. Rommel's last great hope had been something called Operation AXA, a plan to reinforce North Africa massively, to build up such a garrison in the Tunisia bridgehead that the Allies would find it too costly to continue. But this too had died in the abstract spaces of German high command, reduced to words on paper, to questions asked and left unanswered, to requests made to Berlin and returned with vague promises that everyone understood would never be fulfilled. The German economy was overextended. The Soviet Union was consuming manpower and resources at a rate that made Africa seem peripheral, a secondary theatre where Germany was already losing the strategic calculus. By the last week of March, Rommel had been informed that he would be leaving Africa, not retreating with his army, but departing, going home. Officially, it was to deal with his health. In reality, it was because there was nothing more for him to accomplish here. Someone else would be left to manage the endgame. Someone else would write the last desperate reports. Someone else would face the moment when resistance became impossible and surrender became the only choice remaining. Rommel would be spared that particular burden, though whether he saw it as mercy or abandonment is a question that perhaps only he could have answered. On the night before he left, did he stand on some ridge, looking out over the desert that had been, in so many ways, both his kingdom and his prison? There is no record of it, only the knowledge that he spent those final days resolving administrative matters, briefing his successor, and preparing for a journey that would take him away from Africa forever. The moonlight must have been bright in those clear North African nights. The stars would have been the same stars that had shone on his victories and his retreats, constant and indifferent. And somewhere in the darkness, in tents and foxholes and makeshift shelters, German soldiers lay awake or slept poorly, understanding in the way that soldiers understand such things, that their general was leaving them, and that whatever came next would be without his voice, his presence, his restless energy that had animated the campaign for so long. It is one of history's small mysteries, the way a war can continue without its principal characters, the way institutions can persist beyond the moment when the men who created them have departed. Rommel would leave Africa. The campaign would continue, and for the men left behind, the last chance had already slipped away, though none of them could have precisely named the moment when hope transmuted into mere endurance, and endurance became a kind of slow descent into the inevitable. And as November deepens into winter, as the first German reports of torch reach Berlin, and the initial shock begins to settle into a kind of grim reckoning, something larger is becoming visible across the entire theatre of this vast, grinding war. Torch is not, after all, an isolated event, a single, unexpected blow landing on one corner of the Mediterranean. It is part of a turning, a subtle but irreversible pivot in which the Axis powers, still vast in their occupied territories, still formidable in their machinery, begin to lose the initiative they have held for so long. And to understand what this means for Rommel, for the German High Command's frantic decisions in those first winter weeks, we must step back and see Torch not as a beginning, but as one thread in a tapestry that is simultaneously unraveling on three distant fronts. 800 miles to the east, in the deserts around El Alamein in Egypt, something equally profound has just occurred. Montgomery's meticulously prepared British 8th Army, reinforced with American Shermans and endless supplies flowing from the factories of Britain and America, has broken through Axis lines. Rommel, stretched thin and running short of fuel for his panzers, has been forced to withdraw westward. This battle concluded only days before Torch was launched, and there is perhaps no coincidence in the timing. The Allies did not simply stumble upon November as the moment to strike. Their planners coordinated, across thousands of miles of Mediterranean sea and desert, a two-pronged offensive designed to trap the Axis forces in Africa between two grinding wheels. From the east, Montgomery advances. From the west and north, Eisenhower's vast armada brings fresh American and British divisions ashore. The arithmetic becomes inescapable. The Axis position in North Africa, once seemingly secure in its desert vastness, is now a narrowing vice. Rommel, already retreating from El Alamein, now discovers that the ground behind him is no longer empty and open. It is filling with enemy forces landing from the sea. What was meant to be a line of retreat becomes a line of encirclement. Yet even this double squeeze, catastrophic as it is for Axis strategy, does not exist in isolation. Across Europe, at that very same moment in early November 1942, another battle is reaching its terrible crescendo in a city on the Volga River. Stalingrad, the German 6th Army under Friedrich Paulus, committed to taking this Soviet industrial center block by block, street by street, is finding itself pressed by Soviet counteroffensives on multiple fronts. The Russians are executing Operation Uranus, a vast encirclement designed to cut off the German advance at its source. By mid-November, even as German paratroopers are landing in Tunisia to hold off American advances from the west, the 6th Army will find itself surrounded. The supplies cannot reach them. The relief forces cannot break through. What began as a limited tactical setback is hardening into strategic catastrophe. Three massive campaigns, North Africa from both directions, and the Eastern Front at Stalingrad, are reaching their crucible in the same narrow window of time. Can one man, one high command, possibly manage all three? Can Berlin simultaneously reinforce Tunisia, defend Egypt's approaches, and save an entire army trapped in the Russian winter? The question answers itself in the very asking. For Hitler and his inner circle, the realization unfolds with a kind of darkening clarity over these November weeks. The myth of Axis momentum, the belief that Germany and Italy could choose when and where to fight, could shape the war through their own initiative, evaporates. Instead, the war is beginning to shape them. The Allies are no longer reacting to German moves. They are dictating the terms of engagement. They choose where to land. They choose when to attack. They choose how many resources to commit, knowing that their industrial capacity can replenish whatever is lost. Germany, by contrast, finds itself playing defense on three fronts, unable to concentrate force, unable to accept defeat on any single front without unraveling the others. It is a military nightmare made real, and Torch is the nightmare's door opening. Kesselring, commanding in the Mediterranean theatre, understands this with the clarity of a man watching a chess position collapse into endgame. He will commit everything available to Tunisia: paratroopers, mountain divisions, aircraft, what little remains of Axis naval power. He will do this not out of hope of final victory in Africa, though he allows himself to speak in such terms, but out of necessity. To abandon Tunisia would be to hand the Allies a staging ground for operations against Sicily, then mainland Italy. To leave Tunisia would be to surrender the strategic initiative entirely and to invite invasion of Fortress Europe itself. So Kesselring acts with the urgency of a man holding back a tide that he knows, in his bones, cannot ultimately be stopped. Yet he acts nonetheless, because the alternative, passivity, acceptance, is not permitted him, or perhaps more truthfully, it is not permitted by the logic of totalitarian war, which demands that men continue moving toward objectives even when those objectives have become unreachable. And Rommel, reading these reports from Cairo and Stalingrad and Berlin, must assemble in his own mind a picture of a world turned backwards. The war is no longer about what the Axis can accomplish, it is about what the Allies will permit to survive. The desert he once dominated is becoming a prison. The supply lines that once stretched behind him into Libya and Egypt are being cut. The replacements that Berlin promised will not arrive in time, or will not arrive at all. The Luftwaffe, dominant over the Mediterranean 2 years ago, is being ground down by Allied fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Every German advantage that seemed so permanent, so rooted in superiority of will and training, is eroding like a coastline before a rising sea. Perhaps Rommel, in those quiet hours of reading and reflection, understood something that many in Berlin were still denying, that Torch was not a setback to be reversed by another clever offensive maneuver. It was a symptom, a manifestation of a deeper German defeat already taking shape. The Allies no longer needed to be brilliant, they only needed to be patient, to bring their overwhelming industrial might to bear, to apply pressure simultaneously in multiple places until the structure broke. The Tunisian endgame that is about to unfold, the grinding winter campaign, the fierce defensive battles, the final collapse in May 1943, will be, in a sense, a working out of conclusions already written. It will take months, enormous numbers of deaths and casualties, heroic tactical actions, and fierce local victories. But the strategic outcome is already determined on the November night when Torch lands, when the trap closes, when Germany suddenly finds itself fighting a two-front war in Africa, while the pressure from the Soviet Union continues to mount in the east. Rommel will fight with skill and courage in the months ahead. German soldiers will hold positions that seemed impossible to hold, but they will do so in a war that has already been decided at levels far above the tactical brilliance of any single commander. The era of German offensive dominance is ending. The era of Allied pressure, relentless and increasing, has begun. And so we come back now to those same shores where we began, those curved beaches of North Africa, in the pale and diffuse light of early morning, when the desert itself seems to exhale after a long night of holding its breath. The Mediterranean lies still and grey, the colour of old pewter catching the first warmth of the sun, and if you were to stand there in that quiet hour, you might see nothing at all to suggest that anything had changed, and yet everything had. The sand was still sand, the rocks still rough with salt, the air still tasting of minerals and distance. But the men who walked along those strands in November of 1942 were no longer the same men who had stood there in October. Consider for a moment what exhaustion truly means when it is lived in the body rather than merely understood in the mind. It is not a single thing, this fatigue that settles over an army and a continent. It is the accumulation of months of vigilance, of sleeping in vehicles and tents, where the heat never quite leaves the ground, even when the sun descends. It is the wearing away of certainty, the slow erosion of belief in the plans that were laid in distant headquarters, the quiet understanding that something has shifted in the world, and your place in it is no longer what it was meant to be. The soldiers of the Afrika Korps knew this. The men manning the coastal observation posts knew this. The wireless operators in their dusty rooms, relaying fragmented reports of ships and landings and movements they could not fully comprehend, they knew it too. What strikes us now, in the quietness of historical reflection, is how much of this moment was experienced not as a turning point, but as a kind of fog, a continuation of uncertainty under slightly different conditions. For the German soldier in Tunisia, or the Vichy French observer on the Moroccan coast, Operation Torch was not immediately understood as the beginning of the end. It was simply an event, vast and troubling and poorly understood, unfolding in the darkness and in partial glimpses. The true weight of it would not settle until much later, and by then, other memories would have accumulated on top of it, other losses, other evacuations, other dawns that felt identical to this one. If you were to read a letter written by a German staff officer in those first weeks after the landings, you might be struck by the strange mixture of alarm and routine that colours every line. There is the immediate anxiety about supply lines, about the suddenly doubled length of the front, about the arrival of fresh and poorly trained American forces. But threaded through it all is also something more ordinary: requests for leave, complaints about the food, the ordinary rhythms of military bureaucracy continuing, even as the Mediterranean became increasingly a graveyard of supply ships and transport vessels. The mind protects itself from the full weight of catastrophe by retreating into detail, into procedure, into the small immediate problems that can be solved, rather than the large ones that cannot. Rommel himself, when he returned at last to North Africa after his illness and recovery in Europe, carried with him a weariness that no amount of rest had fully dispelled. He understood, perhaps more clearly than any of his superiors, that the strategic game had already been lost before Operation Torch was even launched. The moment the Allies could deploy forces in Morocco and Algeria, the moment they could build airfields and bring aircraft within range of the Mediterranean supply routes, the moment they could establish a second front to the west while the Eighth Army pressed from the east, from that moment, the clock had started running backward for the Axis in Africa, and yet he returned not as a prophet bringing news of inevitable defeat, but as a soldier expected to do what soldiers do, to make the best defense possible, to buy time, to resist. There is something about this that speaks to the profound loneliness of military command. The decisions made in Berlin or Rome could not truly understand what was being asked of the men in the field. The men in the field could not truly communicate to Berlin what was being lost. Between these two silences, a campaign continued, and men died, and ships were sunk, and aircraft fell from the sky, and the desert watched all of it without judgment or commentary. The desert is perhaps the most honest observer of human struggle because it offers no consolation whatsoever. It does not grant mercy. It does not suggest that suffering has meaning beyond itself. And what of the cost that we rarely speak of when we speak of military campaigns? Not the grand cost in terms of territory lost or armies destroyed, but the cost in the quiet dissolution of hope in individual minds. The soldier who received word that his unit was being shipped to Tunisia, who had perhaps believed that the worst was behind him, that the victories of early summer would somehow preserve him from becoming part of a story that was already ending. The officer who had trained men to believe in the invincibility of German arms, and who now had to look at those men and ask them to defend a position that was already indefensible. The father who wrote a letter home from North Africa, not knowing whether it would arrive before events overtook the words he had written. These costs are diffuse and unmeasurable, and they are also the most real costs of all. As the sun climbs now in this imagined dawn over the Tunisian coast, the light spreads across a landscape that seems almost untouched. The white cities inland, Tunis and Bizerte, still stand where they have always stood. The mountains have not moved. The sea continues its ancient rhythms of tide and current, and yet something permanent has changed in the relationship between these shores and the great powers that sought to dominate them. The men who fought and died here, both German and French and Italian and American and British, have become part of this landscape now, woven into its history, inseparable from it. Perhaps one of the deepest truths about war, and about history more broadly, is that the specific passions and convictions of a moment almost never survive very long into the future. The certainties that seem absolute when you are living them, the rightness of a cause or a decision or a strategy, these dissolve and transform until future generations can barely recognize them. We look back at Operation Torch now, and we can see it clearly as a beginning, as a crucial moment in the turning of the war. But to the men who lived it, especially to those who lived it on the German side, it was primarily a disruption, a complication, a problem to be managed in the existing framework of thinking. The frameworks were already cracking, but this was not yet fully apparent. There is a particular kind of sadness in reading the accounts of German soldiers in North Africa during these final months before the campaign ended entirely. Not because they were Germans, but because they were human beings caught in circumstances largely not of their own making, doing their duty as they understood it, maintaining discipline and honor in the face of a situation that had moved beyond the possibility of success. They were not monsters. They were not even, for the most part, true believers in the ideologies that had sent them there. They were professional soldiers, or conscripted soldiers, or soldiers who had made their peace with necessity, and they were tired. The exhaustion that hangs over this entire stretch of history is almost a character in itself. It is the exhaustion of a command structure that had miscalculated fundamentally. It is the exhaustion of supply lines, stretched across impossible distances. It is the exhaustion of men who had fought for months in brutal conditions. It is the exhaustion of strategy that had outlived its own logic. All of these forms of exhaustion flowed into each other, amplified each other, created a kind of momentum toward the inevitable that no amount of tactical brilliance or personal courage could reverse. And so we leave the scene now, as the morning grows fuller, as the Mediterranean begins to wake with the movement of ships and aircraft, as the new day claims North Africa, just as it does every day, indifferent to the human dramas that play out upon its surface. The beach is empty again, in this imagination of ours. The strategic conference tables are silent. The wireless operators have typed their last messages. What remains is the simple fact that a moment happened, a turning occurred, men faced it as best they could, and history moved on from it, carrying all of them, the living and the fallen alike, with it into consequences they could not have foreseen. The light continues to spread, the warmth of the sun becomes more tangible, and in this gradual illumination of a familiar landscape, we might reflect on how history itself works, not in dramatic moments, but in the slow accumulation of decisions and exhaustion and failures to adapt, all of it moving forward, almost of its own weight, until suddenly, the thing that seemed stable has become the thing that has already collapsed.